Hey friends, tonight we're journeying far, far into history to uncover the first time humans used cannabis. And trust me, it's older than your grandpa's classic vinyl collection. We're talking millennia ago, long before sleek vaporizers and loyalty punch cards. Like if you're dreaming of sharing ancient vibes with a cave-dwelling mystic under a wool blanket, you're actually kind of correct. But here's your early warning. You most likely wouldn't survive this trip. Between dangerous landscapes, unfiltered campfires, and strange herbs burning in smoky, cramped shelters, your ancient excursion might feel more like a brief moment than a full saga. So, before you get cozy, take a second to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy my content. And while you're doing that, share your city and IRA in the comments below. I love seeing when and where you're listening from. Now, lower the lights, maybe switch on a fan for that gentle ambient noise. And let's gently begin tonight's voyage together. You're standing on the breezy plains of Central Asia. It's night. The sky is immense and scattered with stars, and your shoes press softly on icy grass. In the distance, wolves are having a loud discussion about something. You've just entered the realm of the ancient Scythians, a wandering people known for their archery on horseback, golden ornaments, and amazingly, their passion for ritualistic cannabis smoke. Yes, before stores had points programs, these folks were igniting it inside woolen yurts. It's about 500 BCE, and the mood is somewhere between old-school festival and meditative steam room. A band of Scythian fighters, still gritty from a lengthy ride, are gathered around a little iron dish that's filled with burning cannabis buds and leaves. You're kindly invited into the tent. Well, it's less of a request and more of a signal followed by being softly pulled in. You duck down, enter, and whoosh. You're immediately surrounded in a heavy, resiny, smoky cloud. It's powerful. There's coughing, a lot of it. You're perspiring from the warmth of the stones, and someone starts chanting in a low, repetitive tone that makes your mind feel like it's drifting on a thermal pool. This, according to Greek writer Herodotus, who had a bit of a rumor-spreading side, is how the Scythians performed their spiritual cleaning. They'd warm rocks, place cannabis onto them, and let the vapor handle the rest. It makes them shout with delight, he recorded, which is an elegant way to describe a prehistoric group smoking session. Consider this. Cannabis wasn't purely for enjoyment back then. For these wandering tribes it was holy, part of death ceremonies, part of spiritual purification. There wasn't exactly a how-to booklet, but this was not a casual evening puff. You didn't burn it unless it held importance. You blink, trying to see through the hazy glow. Around you, fighters sit with legs crossed, their outlines flickering like silhouettes in the firelight. The atmosphere is heavy, not just with vapor, but with purpose. You're not just breathing in cannabis. You're entering a worldview, one where smoke connects the physical world and whatever lies beyond it. For a long time, historians doubted this. For ages, people assumed Herodotus was just overstating things, maybe crafting some intoxicated fantasy of his own. But in 2019, researchers digging in funeral mounds in the Pamir Mountains of western China located wooden dishes with scorched cannabis remains. And not just any cannabis, it was rich in THC. That's correct. These ancient individuals were accidentally lighting up hemp socks. They understood exactly what they were doing. I bet that discovery moved the conversation out of the speculation column and dropped it directly into the, "Oh wow, they really did this" folder. It proved that ceremonial cannabis use in Central Asia was genuine, purposeful, and chemically strong. But here's your interesting detail for the night. The same burial mounds where these ancient burners were found also contained harps, real stringed instruments. So, it's conceivable these funeral rites weren't just hazy. They had background music. Picture someone playing haunting melodies while cannabis smoke drifts around the space, like the initial lo-fi tracks to relax and transcend your soul to. Naturally, this raises issues experts still discuss. Were the Scythians and their neighbors using cannabis only for ceremony, or were they just very spiritually dedicated to feeling altered? Was the mind-altering effect an unintended bonus, or something they cultivated on purpose? And why were their cannabis varieties stronger than expected? Was this ancient plant science or just fortunate gardening? You take a slow breath. Okay, half a breath because it still smells like smoldering herbs, pine, and something else. Your eyes water a little. The fighters are snickering now softly in the way people laugh when they no longer need actual words. You don't comprehend their speech, but you don't truly have to. The flame crackles. The melody hums. Time feels like it's stretching and dissolving. And unexpectedly you feel less like a wanderer from another age and more like someone resting exactly where they're meant to be. And then one of the fighters, face marked with twisting dark lines, leans over and gives you a handcrafted wooden pipe. You pause, not because you're scared, Okay, somewhat scared, but because you're remembering that old phrase, when with Scythians, you don't accept the pipe.
Well, not quite yet. Instead, you lean your head back and let the mist curl around you.
Natural and untamed, like the spirit of a plant that grew under forgotten stars. Your eyes sting less now. You're getting used to it, adapting, becoming part of this strange haze of history. And while the fighters are deep in their ceremonial state, you begin thinking not just about the smoke in your chest, but about the plant itself. Like, who first looked at this tall, rough weed and thought, I should dry this and light it on fire? So you choose to reverse the top line, walk outside the tent, back into the dusty plains, and now you're traveling even further back, way before fire pits and burial customs. You're heading to the earliest chapters of humanity's connection with cannabis sativa. And shockingly, it didn't begin with smoking. You find yourself in ancient Taiwan around 10,000 years ago. That's not an error. You're deep in the Stone Age era when people still considered farming a revolutionary concept and tamed animals meant that goat we hadn't eaten yet. Here cannabis wasn't about moods, it was about living. People were using the sturdy fibrous stalks of the plant to create rope nets and eventually early kinds of fabric. That's accurate. Before cannabis got you buzzed, it helped you secure your boat to a boulder. Move a bit further across this old landscape, and you'll notice signs of cannabis emerging separately in many locations: China, Korea, Central Asia. Everywhere early farmers understood, hey, this stringy plant is pretty incredible. It grows quickly, doesn't need much attention, and if you spin it just correctly, why, it becomes one of the most durable natural threads around. It wasn't attractive, but it was helpful. They didn't need rituals.
They needed rope that didn't break when a fish struggled against the net.
You touch a roughly woven hemp mat hanging in a soot-darkened hut. And yes, it's rough, but it'll last longer than anything you bought on sale last week. And this isn't just a local phenomenon. For thousands of years, people valued cannabis mainly for its practicality. It's the adhesive tape of ancient plants. Need to fasten down a shelter? Hemp.
Need to make writing material.
Hemp. Need to soothe that goat wound on your leg? The seeds create a nice bomb when ground. Even today, hemp seeds are a fashionable smoothie ingredient, but to ancient people, they were a supply of vital protein and grease. Now, here's your interesting detail. Some early proof shows that cannabis was interred with the dead long before folks began smoking it. Not in dishes or tubes, but simply the plant itself, like burial items. Kind of an old world here, take this along. You might need it in the next life moment. Was it meant as remedy, a fabric present, a spiritual donation? That part is unclear. Obvious is that cannabis carried meaning even in its non-euphoric forms. And here's the academic discussion you'll enjoy floating on like a seed in the wind. When did individuals actually start noticing the mind-changing properties of cannabis? Because here's the thing, not all cannabis is identical. The plant has several types, including cannabis sativa and cannabis indica, and their chemical compositions vary. THC, the compound that makes your mind say, hello, doesn't always occur in large amounts. Early hemp plants probably didn't do much beyond making you somewhat drowsy and very regular. So, did ancient humans begin selectively cultivating the stronger kind on purpose? Or was it a fortunate accident, like someone throwing a handful of seeds onto a trash fire and ending up with a whole new mood the following spring? Some experts argue that people didn't really find the drug-like qualities of cannabis until much later. Closer to 3,000 years ago, in places like the Hindu Kush Mountains, where wild cannabis naturally had more THC. Others claim that early people had to notice something. I mean, if you're burning piles of plant material in a confined shelter, someone's bound to feel a bit strange eventually. Back in your time-traveling headspace, you're now seated in a humble Stone Age home. A woman bends by a fire, scraping hemp strands and twisting them into rope. She doesn't speak to you because she can't notice you, but she hums quietly, a little tuneless song that somehow echoes across time. You see she's using rock tools to work the stalks, scraping them clean, drying them by the heat. She's not thinking about feeling high. She's thinking about making fishing nets strong enough to last another season. In the corner, there's a dish of seeds, hemp seeds, round and shiny. They're not for planting, they're for eating. Toasted, maybe nutty and original oil. You place one into your mouth. It's earthy, a little firm, and surprisingly tasty. No buzz, just food, and this is what's so frequently overlooked in the great cannabis discussions of today. This plant started as a laborer, a tough, steady, multi-use tool that assisted in constructing early human society. You weren't resting around debating varieties. You were attempting to fix a torn net before dark. Naturally, time keeps advancing, knowledge grows. Someone somewhere eventually noticed that specific PL. Ants made you feel different. Perhaps it started with a particularly strange batch of seeds. Maybe it was a stress relief moment after gathering season, like, hey, what if we combust the leftover flowers and sit really close to the fire? And then someone chuckled for 10 minutes and forgot the reason. But here, in this instant, under this low Stone Age ceiling, there's no bliss, no hacking, just the sound of twine being twisted into cord, the crack of flame, and the soft drone of a world discovering the calm strength of a plant. Not the rush, not yet, just the start. By now, you've been everywhere, from hemp-twisting huts to hazy tents full of chanting fighters. And honestly, your lungs could use a rest. But history has other ideas for you. As you move ahead again, like a lost seed carried on a breeze, you land in ancient China. It's somewhere around 2700 BCE, give or take a legend or two, and the world smells a little like crushed herbs and faraway incense. Welcome to the cradle of not just silk and fireworks, but also the earliest known cannabis pharmacy. You're in the presence of Shen Nong, the so-called heavenly farmer, who's basically the Paul Bunyan of Chinese herbal medicine. According to story, he has a see-through stomach so he can see how plants affect his organs. Honestly, it sounds like something someone imagined halfway through a fever. But here he is, bent over documents and dried leaves, chewing something green, and looking deeply unimpressed. His old medicine encyclopedia, Shenong Ben Cao Jing, would later list cannabis as a cure for things like joint pain, monthly disorders, and strangely enough, memory loss, which feels like some irony cooked right into the leaves. You're in a quiet yard now, watching as young herbalists grind cannabis seeds into cream and steep flowers into bitter tea. It's not for fun. It's exact, systematic, closer to chemistry than anything you'd recognize as feeling buzzed. People drink it slowly under observation. You lean closer to smell the mixture. It's earthy, sharp, a little spicy, like the breath of an overwatered plant doing its best. Here, cannabis is called ma, and it's treated with deep honor. The old Chinese considered it one of the top elixirs, meaning it was thought to stabilize yin and yang, control energy, and encourage long life. And before you roll your eyes too much, just recall this was a cult. That charted the human body with the precision of subway networks and studied Kai long before you had a phone app to monitor your breathing. But here's your interesting detail. Old Chinese burial locations have produced cannabis plants buried with the deceased. Not woven into string, not pressed into medicine, but placed whole beside the body. That's either a last gift or someone truly didn't want to lose their source. Humor aside, it points to deeper symbolic importance. Cannabis wasn't just a tool. It was something you might require in the next world. As you wander through these centuries-old shops, you notice that the cannabis being utilized isn't necessarily psychoactive. Most of it's industrial hemp, rough, fibrous, low in THC. So, here's where the academic tug-of-war begins. Some researchers claim that early Chinese cannabis culture wasn't about feeling high at all. Others propose that psychoactive strains did exist, but were saved for shamanic rituals or ceremonies so uncommon that they left only light traces in the historical record. And speaking of shamans, let's go ahead and drift a little westward up into the high-altitude valleys of western China. It's cold here, Snow. Dusts the peaks, and you're watching a group of Bronze Age people prepare for a death ceremony. In 2016, researchers discovered a 2,500-year-old burial spot near the town of Turpan, where they found a whole cannabis cloth draped over the body of a man. No lie. 13 whole female flowers placed carefully across his chest like a leafy green quilt. Were they sending him off in fashion, guarding him from bad spirits, ensuring he had something to trade in the afterlife? No one truly knows. But the flowers were mature and clearly farmed, not just collected from a wild field. So even this early, individuals were planting cannabis with purpose. Inside a small ritual tent, someone places dried cannabis onto hot rocks. The scent is sharper than before, strong, almost spicy. It cuts through the cold like a whisper from the afterlife. People sway, softly chanting. Their eyes are half closed not from tiredness, but from something deeper, slower. This isn't casual enjoyment. This is ritual. The line between medicine and mysticism is unclear here, like smoke in a mirror. You wonder whether the individuals involved really understood the chemical properties at work, or if they just knew instinctively that this plant could unlock doors to places your alert mind couldn't fully reach. And then you consider, maybe that's all anyone's ever known about it, even now. As you pull your cloak tighter around your shoulders and step out of the tent into a frozen night, stars spinning overhead like burning seeds, you realize something else. Cannabis wasn't a worldwide joke yet. It wasn't a stoner stereotype or a political argument. It was still silent, still holy, still something whispered about among the flames. And here's the academic discussion that still echoes through research papers like a low drum beat. Was cannabis part of mainstream Chinese culture? Or was it always a fringe item tucked away in the kits of healers and dreamers? Was it a foundation crop or a spiritual extra? And how much did the psychoactive versions really matter compared to the industrial uses? The lines blur. Historians can't settle, but that's kind of ideal, isn't it? You walk back through the moonlit fields where the cannabis once grew, brushing your hands along the stalks that whisper in the breeze like they're sharing secrets. You can almost hear ancient voices in the wind. Healers, shamans, farmers, all line, keyed by this strange, resilient plant. You reach down, pull one gently from the earth, and for a moment it feels like holding a thread that stretches across 5,000 years. You don't light it, not yet. You just hold it and listen. You're not sure when the breeze changes, but suddenly it's warm again. Sticky warm in that way only the Indian subcontinent can be. Air thick with water and something floral floating on it. Possibly jasmine or maybe some mystery flower used in temple garlands. You're in ancient India now, somewhere between 2000 and 1000 BCE, and this place smells like aged stone, sandalwood, and sweet milk boiling in clay pots. You wipe your forehead, squint at the sun, and immediately realize you've just stepped into one of the longest continuous cannabis relationships in human history. Because India didn't just accept cannabis, it celebrated it. Holy texts, the Vedas, call it one of the 5 holy plants gifted by the gods themselves. According to legend, when the gods stirred the cosmic ocean, as one does, they produced amrita, the nectar of forever life. A few drops splashed onto the ground, and from those drops sprouted the cannabis plant. That's right, holy spillage. You don't get more legendary than that. Walk into the center of a village during a celebration, and you'll see it. Large brass pots filled with a cool greenish drink called bang, made by crushing cannabis leaves into a paste and mixing it with milk, spices, sugar, and occasionally almonds. You're offered a cup before you can refuse, and the flavor hits somewhere between pistachio ice cream and liquid lawn cuttings. But it's strangely nice, and very slowly, everything starts to feel just a bit softer around the edges. But this isn't about feeling high in the fun sense. Here, bang is ceremonial. You're surrounded by color, chanting, and marigolds. You're not at a party. You're at a temple celebration for Lord Shiva, who, by the way, is the original poster god for cannabis. People say he discovered the plant while walking in the Himalayas, exhausted and affected by the sun. After relaxing in the shade of a tall cannabis plant, he ate some of its leaves, felt refreshed, and became forever linked with its energy. So now, each year, millions of Hindus drink bang during Mahashivaratri, a holy night dedicated to Shiva. It's not about leaving reality. It's about moving beyond it. NT to pray, contemplate, and possibly giggle at nothing in particular for a little while. You drink your bang again. It's grainy near the bottom. There's a coolness in your limbs now, but your mind feels strangely open. You stroll past pilgrims smeared with ash, their eyes shining, voices slow, offering small lumps of cannabis at roadside shrines. The line between dedication and drunkenness is unclear here. But no one is criticizing. In fact, in some holy cities like Varanasi, ascetics called sadhus openly smoke cannabis from clay tubes called chillums, sharing puffs as part of spiritual practice. You watch as they close their eyes, push the smoke skyward, and breathe out prayers like dragons who've witnessed many things. Here's your interesting detail for this stop. Bang is legally sold in parts of India to this day, often from government-run shops with names like Bang Center Number 3, which sounds like a mix between a drugstore and a secret hideout. And yes, you can walk up and buy cannabis-infused drinks with the same casual tone you'd use for a mango smoothie. Just maybe don't gulp it all at once, unless you have nowhere to be for the next 6 hours. But here's where it gets complex and where experts still argue over cultural meaning. Was cannabis use always this spiritually approved? Or did that link evolve slowly, layered with centuries of ritual, folk medicine, and creative understanding? Some academics believe bang was originally limited to specific priestly classes and spread over time into common tradition. Others argue that cannabis was always deeply rooted in rural religious practices, far from the fancy temples and Sanskrit writers. Like most things in history, it's probably both and neither, and impossible to define neatly. You walk through a busy market now, and there are stalls selling all kinds of cannabis products. Nothing labeled, but you can smell it. Some people chew it with betel leaf, others boil it into sweet syrups. You're offered a piece of sticky cannabis candy wrapped in dried banana leaf. It's surprisingly strong, and your steps slow as your ideas stretch. But even here, amid spiritual highs and sweet milk drinks, you can feel the change. Not everyone approves. Some rulers over the centuries tried to control or forbid cannabis, calling it distracting or morally wrong. There were orders, discussions, and more than one official. Side-eye aimed at holy men with red eyes. And yet, the plant persisted, woven into the spiritual, medical, and food threads of Indian life. Even in Ayurvedic medicine, the old wellness system still used today, cannabis holds a place. It's considered both powerful and risky. A double-sided leaf that can heal or harm depending on who's holding it. It's used to treat digestion, sleeplessness, worry, and more. But always with balance, always under guidance. This isn't the modern take two candies and hope for the best approach. It's careful, purposeful. You sit down beneath a banyan tree as the sky shifts orange and pink. A wandering musician plays a slow looping song on a string tool. And nearby, two old men argue very quietly about whether Shiva prefers chillum smoke or bang. You lean your head back against the tree, letting their voices drift past. You're not sure there's a correct answer. Maybe Shiva's fine with both. You close your eyes and for a moment it all clicks. The respect, the ceremony, the long history of a plant that's never quite just a plant. Not here, not in India. Here, cannabis isn't just a substance, it's a gift, a guide, a friend for the soul as it tries to reach somewhere a little higher. You're still warm, still feeling the echo of bells and the taste of bang lingering on your tongue. But the light starts to shift again. The air dries out. The colors get dustier. You blink and the marigolds are gone, replaced by olive trees, white stone columns, and the distant murmur of the sea. Welcome to the Mediterranean, ancient Greece to be exact. The era of tunics, togas, and thinkers who spent entire afternoons debating whether reality even existed. And somewhere between their arguments and their watered wine, you start to wonder, did they ever light up? The answer is probably, kind of, maybe. This part of history is where things get nicely vague. Unlike India and China, which had the decency to write things down clearly, the Greeks and their neighbors were a bit more mysterious when it came to cannabis. But you've learned to read the hints, and the hints here are all pointing to yes, though with a little side of plausible denial. You're walking now through an open-air market in Athens around the 5th century BC. The air smells like cooked fish, sun-warmed pottery and ground herbs. You pass stalls where people sell olive oil, honey cakes, ND bundles of dried plants tied together with string. One of those bundles looks suspiciously familiar. Long, thin leaves, sharp edges, a faintly funky scent if you lean in. You don't say anything, neither does the seller. You just raise an eyebrow and she gives you the tiniest nod. Cannabis wasn't a star player in old Greek texts. It shows up but quietly. The physician Dioscorides wrote about it in the 1st century CE, calling it cannabis and noting that it could be used to treat swelling and earaches. Earlier mentions are more subtle, but the Greeks were connected to the Scythians. Remember them? The hotboxing nomads from the steppe. Well, the Greeks loved to trade with them. And the Scythians brought more than gold and horses. They brought habits. So now you're at a symposium, not the word presentation kind, but the kind where upper-class men lie on couches, drink wine, and discuss philosophy, until someone falls asleep or tries to sing. You're the quiet guest in the corner, watching as a thin column of smoke rises from a bronze bowl. It's not incense. It's not just sage or... it smells sharper.
Someone leans over and mutters something about Scythian fire, and everyone...
Annie chuckles like it's a secret joke. One guy tries to quote Plato but forgets halfway through and just shrugs. You feel a little lighter yourself. The thing is, Greek society had a complex relationship with drunkenness. Wine totally acceptable as long as it was diluted and sipped carefully. Drunkenness, a bit go, unless you were at a Dionysian festival, in which case anything was allowed. Cannabis, well, it wasn't center stage, but it definitely lurked behind the curtains. And then there are the Scythians again, still doing their hazy rituals. Greek historians loved writing about them, especially Herodotus, who couldn't resist adding a few dramatic touches. You hear whispers among the Greeks about those strange northern people who ride horses, pierce everything, and sit in tents filled with strange vapors. They inhale it, someone says with a shiver, on purpose. But here's your interesting twist. Cannabis might have also played a role in burial practices among Thracians and Dacians, neighbors to the Greeks who used mind-altering plants in their death ceremonies. There's archaeological proof of burned cannabis seeds in burial sites around the Black Sea, suggesting that the Scythe, an approach, wasn't all that isolated. It spread quietly like smoke under a door. Now you're drifting toward the eastern edges of the Greek world into Persia, where Zoroastrianism is on the rise. Here, cannabis might have been part of the Hyoma ceremony, a holy drink used by priests and spiritual explorers to cause visions. Experts still debate what the actual ingredients were. Some say cannabis, others say ephedra or poppy. Maybe it was a whole mixture of cosmic plant power, but the idea is the same. changed consciousness as a gateway to the divine. And this is where the academic discussions get loud. Did the Greeks knowingly use cannabis for mind-altering effects? Or were they just bringing it for rope and oil and accidentally catching a contact high at the odd funeral? There's no clear proof, or smoking scroll as it were. Some say cannabis was strictly medicinal or practical. Others argue that, like wine, it had a place in social or religious life, but people were just too polite to admit it directly. You're now sitting on a sun-warmed step outside a white-painted building. A philosopher is giving a lecture nearby about the nature of goodness, but half the audience is sleepy, and the other half is distracted by the rising scent of something familiar. You glance at a nearby student unrolling a twist of dried leaves into a small clay pipe. He lights it, breathes in, and then stares at the sky like he's seeing it for the first time. You ask yourself, does it matter if they called it cannabis or if they admitted to its effects? The practice is there.
The smoke, the leaves, the whispers between friends at dusk. In this Mediterranean sunlight, nothing is written in bright letters, but it's written in the margins, tucked between the olive oil jugs and the half-remembered poems. The Greeks didn't need to declare it. They just passed it quietly, like an afterthought, like something too old to be new, too holy to be shameful. You lean back. The white stones are warm beneath you. Somewhere nearby, a lyre plays a soft, wandering tune. The air smells like the past, faintly smoky, vaguely floral, and always just out of reach. The white marble of the Greek world fades behind you, and the sun begins to lower, stretching shadows across dry hills and long rivers. You ride the breeze eastward through golden deserts and the roofs of old cities shining under the sun until you land in the center of the Islamic Golden Age. It's the 9th century now, somewhere between Baghdad, Cairo, and Samarkand, and everything smells like honey, parchment, and saffron. You're in a world of scholars, mystics, and poets, where knowledge flows like water through the waterways of civilization. And tucked into the corners of this intellectual bloom, hashish. Yeah, the strong stuff. Hashish isn't new by this point, but here it's reaching something close to famous status. While cannabis flowers had been smoked or brewed into drinks in other parts of the world, here they're being concentrated. You've gone from leafy tea to sticky paste, sticky, dark, and strong. Hashish is made by separating the trichomes from the cannabis plant and pressing them. Kind of like if you took all the sparkle and weirdness of the plant and concentrated it into a square. It's the espresso of old-world highs. You're wandering now through a shaded courtyard in Baghdad. It's quiet, except for the soft trickle of a fountain and the distant call of a muezzin. A few scholars sit with legs crossed on cushions discussing geometry and the movement of stars. Nearby, 2 men pass a small piece of hashish between them, not smoked, eaten, mixed into honey or wrapped in dates. One of them giggles softly and loses his place mid-sentence. No one seems to mind, and that's the thing. While alcohol was forbidden in Islamic societies due to religious law, cannabis and especially hashish slipped through the gaps. It wasn't exactly approved, but it wasn't always forbidden either. For many, it was a loophole. For others, a medicine, and for some, especially the Sufis, it was a route to the divine. You find yourself drawn into a small Sufi gathering. There's chanting, rhythm, dancing, breathing exercises, the kind of spiritual practice that aims to remove the ego and find union with God. And for certain Sufis, cannabis played a role in that search. Taken in small portions, it was seen as a tool to unlock perception, calm the mind, and deepen meditation. You're offered a bite of a sweet hashish confection. You chew slowly as music swirls around you. It's not about running away. It's about expansion. But not everyone was thrilled with the rise of hashish. The more traditional thinkers saw it as a danger to social order, a distraction from faith and duty. Over time, orders were issued. Hashish was banned, banned, rebanned. Penalties ranged from whippings to exile to being mocked in a poem. Possibly the worst punishment in a literary age.
And here's your interesting fact. The word assassin might come from the Arabic hashishiyah, a term reportedly used for a secret group of Nizari Ismailis who were said to use hashish before carrying out political killings.
Now, modern researchers are very split on this. Some say it's complete fiction, Islamophobic lies dreamed up by crusaders and European storytellers who couldn't believe anyone would kill for beliefs alone. Others argue that there was a ceremonial use of hashish among the group, just not quite in the Hollywood slow-motion murder kind of way. But either way, the link stuck. Hashish became both mystical and threatening in the cultural imagination. In some stories, it was the drug of prophets and poets. In others, it was the whisper of chaos and rebellion. You can feel both tales living in the air here. In the quiet gardens where mystics sit in peace, and in the alleys where less spiritual types laugh a little too loudly after their hashish has taken hold. And that's where the academic debate gets sharp.
Was cannabis accepted in Israel?
Islamic societies or tolerated quietly in hidden rooms and fringe groups? Did its medical use protect it from criticism, or did it just fly under the radar thanks to the lack of strong smell compared to alcohol? Some argue that hashish culture was central to the Islamic world's artistic and mystical traditions. Others say it was always on the edges, always a little scandalous, always one poet away from being outlawed again. You walk through a narrow street lit by oil lamps. The walls are painted with verse. Poets here don't just rhyme, they shimmer. You pass a man leaning against a doorway reciting, "Smoke of hashish, veil of joy, frees the soul, lights the night." He winks at you. Is it poetry or prophecy?
Maybe both. As the night deepens, you sit down near the Tigris River. The stars are sharp tonight. Pinpricks of light spread across a velvet sky. Someone nearby plays a stringed instrument, the melody soft and repeating. You nibble the last bit of hashish-laced honey from earlier, and a calm clarity washes over you.
This isn't wild or chaotic. It's slow, intentional. There's a reason mystics embrace this, and yet, it wouldn't last forever.
Politics shift. Empires rise.
Default. Views toward cannabis would continue to swing wildly across the centuries. But here, in this moment, you're at a crossing between medicine and mysticism, between science and story, between the forbidden and the holy. The breeze off the river is cool. You lie back, eyes drifting toward the stars. And in that stillness, you start to understand why some believed cannabis wasn't just a plant. It was a messenger. Morning creeps up again, gold and soft, and the Tigris slips away behind you like a dream. The call to prayer fades into the sky, replaced by something drier, dustier, more ancient. You find yourself in North Africa now, close to the Nile, with the scent of date trees and warm stone thick in the air. You're heading into another chapter of cannabis history that doesn't get nearly enough attention. Because while the classical world and the Islamic Golden Age were tossing the plant between medicine and mysticism, Africa, especially parts of East and Central Africa, was quietly building its own relationship with cannabis. It just took a bit longer for the smoke to appear. You're walking through a village that hugs the Nile, and it's not modern Egypt yet.
This is old.
Pyramids old, pharaohs old.
But here's the thing. Despite all the grand buildings, the civilization, the detailed notes carved into walls, Egypt's relationship with cannabis is unclear. Like suspiciously quiet, and that in itself is fascinating. You peek into an ancient drugstore corner where shelves are stacked with oils and dried herbs. Papyrus scrolls flutter in the breeze like sleepy flags. One of them mentions shemshemat, a word some researchers believe could mean cannabis. The Egyptians had hundreds of plants catalogued for healing. Aloe, lotus, frankincense. But cannabis?
It gets just a whisper. And maybe a parenthetical note in a tomb full of bold headlines.
So, here's your first open question of the night. Why didn't cannabis have a presence in old Egyptian medicine, especially when the region clearly had access to the plant? Was it culturally ignored, used in a way that didn't need recording? Or were the historians just more interested in beetles and eyeliner recipes?
Fast forward a bit, and suddenly the silence lifts. You're moving south across the Sahara and into sub-Saharan Africa, where cannabis starts showing up in real, tangible, smokable ways. It arrives in the region. From multiple directions through Arab merchants from the northeast, Indian Ocean sailors from the east, and possibly from early contact with Asia via long-lost land paths. However it arrived, it took root, and not just in earth, in culture. You're standing in a small village in Central Africa now, sometime in the early centuries CE, and the air smells distinctly herbal. Someone's cooking porridge over a fire, and a small group of men sit in a circle passing around a long wooden pipe carved with animal faces. The laughter is low and frequent like waves breaking in slow motion. Cannabis here becomes a social lubricant, a ritual ingredient, a healer. It's not industrialized like in ancient China, not as religiously formalized as in India. Instead, it's woven into everyday life, used in coming-of-age ceremonies, medicinal drinks, and quiet evening smokes after a day of farming under a brutal sun. And here's your interesting fact. In some African traditions, cannabis was thought to defend people from bad spirits or improve communication with ancestors. There are verbal histories where cannabis smoke is used to awaken memory during funerals, like opening a mental doorway between the living, and the dead. You can almost see it. The smoke rising into the night, curling upward like a ladder of thought. The method of use here is different, too. Pipes dominate, not rolled leaves or sweet drinks. These are carved from wood, clay, and sometimes bone. You hold one in your hands now, warm from the fire, smooth where 1,000 fingers have passed it.
The bowl is packed tightly. You can smell the smoke before it even reaches your mouth. Earthy, heavy like the land itself. And here comes the scholarly argument.
Was cannabis native to Africa or completely imported? Some believe wild varieties existed across parts of the continent long before historical writing, while others insist that cannabis was introduced and only later adopted and grown. It's one of those ongoing archaeological debates with no clear winner. Just bits of pollen, half-burned seeds, and thousands of years of smoke lost to the wind. You drift west through centuries and shifting borders until you reach the coastal regions of Angola and Congo. Portuguese traders are arriving now, their ships full of spices, ivory, and sadly enslaved people. But there's another layer to this history, one that isn't carved into tea. EXT books as often as it should be. Enslaved Africans brought their knowledge of cannabis with them to the Americas. It traveled not just in bags and bundles, but in memory, practice, and ritual. On some plantations in Brazil and the Caribbean, enslaved Africans grew cannabis secretly in garden patches, smoked it in hidden circles, and passed down songs and stories wrapped in its haze. Colonial authorities noticed they weren't fans. As early as the 18th century, laws were put in place stopping enslaved people from smoking cannabis, calling it a corrupting influence, a danger to control. And now you're standing at the edge of a field in colonial Saint-Domingue, future Haiti, watching a woman crush dried cannabis leaves into a paste and mix it with herbs to rub into a child's aching leg. She doesn't call it medicine. She just knows it works. There's no label, no amount, no Latin term, just tradition passed through time like a living guide. You start to realize something deeper. Cannabis in Africa wasn't just a plant. It was survival, comfort, resistance. Whether as a medicine, a spiritual guide, or a quiet form of rebellion, it rooted itself in communities where it was needed most. When it moved across oceans, it carried stories. Back under the wide African sky, stars blinking to life one by one. You sit near a cooking fire. Someone passes the pipe again. The night is quiet but full. You take a slow breath in and feel it. Not just the smoke, but the weight of history, the warmth of memory, the hum of a plant that has always meant more than it seems. You blink and the stars rearrange. The campfire dims, replaced by the glow of stained glass windows and flickering candlelight. Welcome to medieval Europe, where the air smells like damp stone, boiled cabbage, and a mild hint of sickness. Things are a little stiff here. People are wrapped in wool. Superstition is thicker than the fog rolling over the fields. And you're pretty sure someone nearby just accused their neighbor of being a witch because their bread rose too quickly. It's not exactly a great time for herbal testing, but that doesn't mean cannabis vanished. It just went unnoticed. You find yourself in a walled village surrounded by farms. A woman bends in her garden, her fingers busy with a tall, wiry plant, fibrous, leafy, clearly practical. It's hemp, cannabis sativa, but the industrial kind. Low in THC, high in practical value. This plant isn't for pottying, it's for robes, sails, cloth, and probably the monk's scratchy robe. You touch one of us all. Rough, strong, and oddly dignified. Hemp was Europe's favorite plant nobody wanted to discuss at dinner. And here's where you really start to feel the change. For centuries in Europe, cannabis was basically reduced to a blue-collar worker. No more spiritual respect, no poetic verses, just rope, textiles, a bit of medical use if you had a literate monk nearby. You walk into a monastery and sure enough, tucked between shelves of dried mint and chamomile, there's a jar labeled cannabis. It's not flashy, but it's there. Used in poultices, sometimes in teas, maybe to treat swelling or assist with childbirth, and always wrapped in the kind of clinical language that makes it sound more like a receipt than a plant. Here's your interesting fact. Medieval plant experts sometimes included cannabis in recipes to treat what they politely called female issues, a broad term that covered everything from cramps to mood changes to the unspeakable horror of menopause. These treatments were passed down through guidebooks, many of which read like a mix between a cookbook and a mysterious warning. One recipe requires cannabis soaked in goat's milk and blessed 3 times under a full moon. So, pretty normal stuff. But you also notice that the farther you travel from the monastery, the looser the rules become. In rural areas, cannabis grows wild along paths and fields. Peasants who had no official medical training but plenty of common sense use the leaves in homemade bombs or toss them into flames to hide the smell of whatever died behind the barn last week. Some even start noticing that breathing the smoke makes you relaxed, just a little more patient with your ox. Still, there's a major mood killer looming over all this: the church. While cannabis isn't directly condemned, the general attitude toward changed states is chilly at best and blasphemous at worst. Anything that shifted perception that let you see beyond the agreed reality could land you a starring role in your own personal witch trial. Spiritual highs weren't in fashion unless they came with incense and Latin. But here's where the scholarly arguments flare up like a chimney fire. Some historians claim cannabis was quietly used as a mind-altering substance. Ounce in certain folk rituals across Europe, especially in Slavic and Baltic regions. Others say there's no solid proof, and that it was strictly industrial or medical. One side points to old recipes and folk songs suggesting herbs that open the mind. The other side rolls their eyes and demands chemical leftovers. Honestly, they're both probably right. You can almost see it. A farmer's wife tossing a handful of dried leaves into the blaze, watching her husband get oddly thoughtful after dinner, and then just deciding not to mention it to the priest. You step into a bustling medieval port town. Now, somewhere along the Mediterranean coast, merchants from across the known world are docking, unloading spices, silk, and yes, cannabis products. Not leafy weed, but fiber and oil. European rope makers and textile mills are thriving on hemp imports. And while nobody's passing joints on the docks, the plant is moving, quietly weaving its way into the sails that push ships across the sea. One of those ships you realize is heading for the New World. But we'll save that for later. Back on land, you pass a tavern. Inside, the beer is warm, the stew is suspicious, and the conversation is mostly calm.
Complaining.
But in the corner, an old woman is telling stories, telling a story about a healer who used green smoke to calm a haunted man. Everyone laughs nervously. You look closer, and there's a bundle of dried leaves tucked into the beams above her head. Maybe they're just herbs for cooking, or maybe not. The truth is, cannabis in medieval Europe was less about rebellion and more about usefulness. No grand ceremonies, no ecstatic dreams, just quiet practicality. It fixed sails, made rope for churches, softened childbirth, and maybe, just maybe, helped a few overworked farmers feel like the world wasn't pushing quite so hard on their shoulders. You sit down in a field at the village edge, watching the hemp sway in the breeze. It's not beautiful, it's not wild, but there's something lovely about its steadiness. The way it just appears century after century doing its job, waiting for someone to truly see it again. The hemp fields ripple one last time before they disappear. And just like that, you're airborne again. Only this time you're crossing a whole ocean. Below you, thick forests stretch across the Americas, broken by winding rivers and smoke from distant fires. It's the pre-sea. A Lumbian world now before ships, greed for gold, and European discoveries. You're landing among civilizations that rose high on pyramids and maize in a hemisphere where cannabis has not yet taken root. At least not the ones you know. You're in the middle of a Maya settlement now, and the first thing you notice is how green everything is. Jungle vines curling around temples, fruit trees dripping with color, the air heavy with moisture, and a symphony of bugs. The Maya are busy carving symbols, charting the stars, and perfecting chocolate. But cannabis, not in sight. You ask around silently, invisibly, and the herbalists give you bundles of bark, flowers, seeds, but none of them are cannabis sativa. Because here's the twist. Cannabis is an old-world plant. It didn't exist in the Americas before European contact. No one in pre-colonial Mexico or Peru or the Pacific Northwest was puffing on joints, mixing bang or weaving hemp sandals. It just wasn't here. The land had its own plant toolbox. Tobacco, peyote, yopo, psilocybin, mushrooms, and ayahuasca. And make no mistake, these cultures knew how to explore consciousness. They had their own holy plants, rituals, and deep beliefs around.
Changed states. They just didn't have weed. You sit with legs crossed inside a ceremonial hut, watching as a shaman prepares a tobacco blend so strong it could probably knock out a donkey.
The smoke is blown through a hollow red into a young beginner's nose.
And the effect is immediate.
His eyes roll back, his breathing slows, and the ceremony begins.
There's chanting, drumming, dreams. This is not your cousin's vape pen in the backyard. This is drug-based teleportation and still no cannabis inside. Here's your interesting facts.
While cannabis didn't make it to the Americas until after 1492, some researchers believe that the Americas' native psychedelics shaped the idea of spiritual plants globally. European explorers, upon encountering these rituals, began reassessing the plants they'd always taken for granted. It's not that the Americas needed cannabis. It's that their relationship with nature was already so rich and complex that it expanded what plants could mean everywhere else. Now, fast forward a few hundred years. The boats have arrived. Germs, steel, and guns are rewriting entire societies. Alongside them, seeds. Lots of seeds. Wheat, barley, sugarcane, and cannabis. Wine. You watch as European settlers and colonial powers begin planting hemp across North and South America. But again, it's not the fun kind. It's industrial. Rope for ships, cloth for sails, sturdy fibers for all the empire's work. In British colonies like Jamestown, hemp is practically required. Laws are passed requiring farmers to grow it. You walk through rows of tall, skinny plants waving under a Carolina sun. Impressive, but completely unsmokable. THC barely a trace. You pick a leaf and chew it. Nothing happens except your mouth gets dry, and you start to seriously reconsider your life choices. And yet, something's happening under the surface. While European settlers are all about hemp's material, enslaved Africans brought violently across the ocean carry with them knowledge of cannabis as medicine, ritual, and release. In Brazil, in the Caribbean, and eventually in the American South, a woman is crushing leaves and flowers into its older, stronger
Not
forms.
unlike what you saw in
Not
Central
because of
Africa.
colonial
She applies
science,
it to a man's
but
sore
because of
joints,
cultural
humming
memory.
as she works.
You
No
step
one
into a
taught her that
makeshift
here.
garden behind a
She
small
brought it up that
cabin.
Cannabis didn't naturally spread to the Americas. It was carried deliberately, sometimes secretly, sometimes violently. And that means its early use in the New World was fragmented, coded, and deeply shaped by race, power, and resistance.
While European colonists viewed it as rope, others saw it as relief, escape, prayer, a piece of home in a world turned upside down.
You stroll into a Haitian village. Now, decades later, the revolution has happened, and free black communities are rebuilding their lives.
You see cannabis again being smoked casually in the evening, the way others sip wine.
No celebration, no sermons, just rhythm and ritual.
A slow exhale against a long day.
Of course, this is where the record gets unclear.
Most colonial documents ignore or hide these practices. Cannabis doesn't make it into many records, except as a footnote in plantation inventories or in the warnings of nervous priests.
But the silence doesn't mean it wasn't there. It just me.
Ions, you have to look harder at the stories passed down, the songs, the patterns of planting and use. And here comes the scholarly debate. When exactly did mind-altering cannabis, not hemp, take hold in the Americas? Was it smuggled in by enslaved people, brought later by Indian workers after slavery was ended? Did it evolve in hidden gardens, or pop up once wild strains began adapting to their new environment? No one fully agrees. It's all theories, pollen samples, and educated guesses. But the signs are there, like smoke on the wind. You're walking now through a sugarcane field at dusk. The day's work is done, and a small group sits together sharing food, stories, and something wrapped in a corn husk.
The smoke drifts upward. It's soft, slow, nothing flashy.
But you can tell it's not just tobacco, and it's not just habit. It's culture being carried forward one breath at a time. Cannabis in the pre-modern Americas wasn't loud. It wasn't legal, but it was alive, growing in secret, rooting in places history forgot to notice. The smoke clears and the sugarcane disappears behind you, replaced by three-cornered hats, stiff collars, and a smell in the air that can only be described as all
Daytime body odor with a hint of molasses. Welcome to the 17th and 18th centuries, colonial times, the age of empire, the era of fancy wigs and terrible ideas. You're now fully in the new world, but everything is still wearing an old world outfit. And cannabis, oh, it's here, just not in the way you're hoping. You're walking along a dirt road in Virginia, and you don't have to look far to find hemp fields. They're everywhere, required by law in some places. George Washington himself grew hemp at Mount Vernon, not as a side business for mellow feelings, but because every decent landowner knew you needed rope, sailcloth, and sturdy canvas. This plant was useful, dependable, about as exciting to the colonial upper class as a bag of potatoes, except with more paperwork. You wander into one of these fields, brushing your fingers against the rough, fibrous stalks. The plants tower over you, not lush and fragrant like today's special cannabis strains, but wiry, stiff, and extremely uninterested in your spiritual journey. These are hemp workers, bred for strength, not softness. If you're hoping for a buzz, you're going to be very disappointed and probably a little itchy. Back in the town square,
You overhear a conversation. A merchant is complaining about a shipment of hemp string that got wet in the hold and grew mold.
another man suggests switching to flax, and suddenly you're deep in a colonial argument about cordage. You slowly back away, realizing no one here is thinking about cannabis as anything other than rope. There are no pipes, no ceremonies, no lounges with soft cushions, just usefulness. But here's where things start to get weird. Because while the upper class is focused on fiber, the lower classes and enslaved people might have had a very different view. You find yourself in a small outbuilding behind a plantation house. A man is grinding leaves with a stone, mixing them with fat to make a salve for sore muscles. He doesn't call it medicine.
He doesn't call it anything. It's just something you do. Pass on, remember.
In the Caribbean, it's a little louder. You drift to Jamaica in the late 1600s and find a busy colonial port, merchants from Britain, enslaved people from Africa, workers from India, all packed together in a chaotic, salty mix of trade and mistreatment. And there, hidden among the sugarcane and rum barrels, are the first sparks. Cannabis used for something other than sales. Indian indentured servants brought to the Caribbean in the 19th century, but whose roots are forming even earlier in the cultural soil carry with them, are called ganja, and they don't just grow it. They use it smoked in pipes, chewed, steeped in teas, not for rope, not for cloth, but for calm, for meditation. For relief, you sit by a campfire with them as the sun drops below the palm trees. The pipe passes slowly, and the conversation drifts with it, quiet chuckles, eyes half closed, a calm born not from drunkenness, but from something gentler. It's not about checking out. It's about staying sane in a system designed to crush you. And here's your interesting fact. While colonial governments were obsessed with taxing rum, controlling opium, and stopping any form of dissent, cannabis, low-profile, humble cannabis, was often ignored. It slipped through the gaps, quiet, unregulated, treated as nothing more than a local habit. The poor person's pastime, but gaps eventually get noticed. And by the late 18th century, European doctors are starting to catch on, not to smoking weed, but to using it in mixtures and tonics. You peek into a dusty drugstore.
In London, the shelves are lined with brown bottles labeled in precise curly writing. Cannabis extract for nerve pain, muscle spasms, hysteria. You read the ingredients.
Alcohol, cannabis resin, laudanum, a sprinkle of Victorian hope. Doctors begin to write long, detailed case studies about the calming effects of cannabis. Queen Victoria's personal doctor even recommends it for monthly cramps. And this is where the scholarly debate ignites. Was cannabis actually common in colonial medicine, or just a trendy fad among the wealthy? Was it quietly used among enslaved communities and servants, long before the doctors became curious? And how much did empire play a role in shaping the image of the plant?
Not just what it was, but who was allowed to use it. You move through a colonial port city, maybe Boston, maybe Charleston, and notice a pattern. Hemp mills, shipyards, rope walks stretching hundreds of feet, and just beyond them, tucked away behind market stalls and stables, are tiny backyard plots. Some wild, some planned, all growing something that looks just a little too leafy to be lettuce. Cannabis in colonial America was a split personality.
On the surface, it was practical.
Red, utterly boring. But underneath, especially in ignored communities, it was something else, something older, familiar, unspoken. It wasn't front and center yet, but it was waiting in the wings, ready to step back into the spotlight once the rope business started to weaken. And that's the thing about history. It's not just about what's written down. It's about what's remembered in kitchens, whispered over fences grown in the margins. While the founding fathers were busy creating hemp laws and printing on hemp paper, someone in a nearby shack was rolling a leaf between their fingers, lighting it, and watching the smoke curl up into the beams. Not because it was fashionable, not because it was medical, but because it felt right. You sit down on a crate near the docks, the salty air stinging your face. Above you, sails made of hemp flap in the breeze. Ships groan and creak, heading for other shores. And somewhere nearby, someone lights something small and green and takes a slow, thoughtful drag. The harbor wind fades, and so do the wigs and waistcoats. You're shifting again, this time to the end of the 18th century. Just as empires are flexing their muscles in places they don't belong. You land on the banks of the Nile, but it's not pharaonic Egypt anymore. It's French-occupied Egypt. Yes, that's right. Napoleon is here, dragging with him not only soldiers and cannons, but a full group of scientists, artists, and professional mood killers. It's hot, chaotic, and full of the kind of uncomfortable colonial energy that makes you want to stand politely behind a palm tree and observe from a distance. The year is 1798, and Napoleon's campaign in Egypt is a whole fever dream of fighting and confusion. You're walking through a busy Cairo street, avoiding camels, carts, and the thick smell of spice and sweat. And then you catch a whiff of something else. It's earthy, sweet, smoky. You follow it to a narrow alley, where a group of locals is sitting in a smoky cafe, puffing slowly on long-necked pipes, and laughing like they just heard the funniest joke in a decade. You don't know the language, but you know the mood. This is hashish. The French soldiers do too. At first they're just observing, same as you. But it's not long before curiosity wins out. Alcohol is scarce. Napoleon banned it for the troops, and hashish starts looking like a pretty appealing replacement. Soon so. Ladies are seen relaxing in cafes, giggling in tents and maybe spacing out a little too much on watch. The military leaders are not amused. Hashish is declared off limits. The order is clear. No smoking, eating or drinking cannabis in any form. Naturally, everyone ignores it. And that's your interesting fact. Napoleon's army might have been the first Western military group to experience widespread cannabis use among its soldiers and then panic about it. Soldiers returning home carried stories and possibly samples back to France. Hashish entered Europe not through trade or science, but through war, through a dusty, accidental meeting with a culture that had been using it for centuries, while the Europeans were still too busy sewing buttons onto socks. Now you're drifting back to Paris, early 1800s. The revolution is over, sort of, and the city is deep in a new fascination. Orientalism. Everything vaguely Middle Eastern is trendy.
Scarves, tea, curved swords, and yes, hashish. Not just any hashish, though. This is the stuff of story wrapped in mystery and sprinkled with dramatic style. You're now inside a dimly lit room seated with legs crossed among writers, artists, and philosophers.
With extremely dramatic facial hair.
This is the Club des Hashishkins, the club of the hashish eaters. And this real-life group met throughout the mid-1800s in Paris, using hashish as a kind of creative fuel. They didn't just nibble it, they played with it. Hashish was often consumed as dawamesk, a jam-like mixture of cannabis, pistachio, cinnamon, nutmeg, and rosewater. They'd eat a spoonful, then wait as the walls started to melt, and their minds opened like creaky old windows. Gustave Flaubert, Charles Baudelaire, Victor Hugo. They all dipped in at some point. Some were curious, some were frightened. One man reportedly believed he had turned into a glass of water and was too afraid to move, fearing he would spill. Meanwhile, European scientists, always a few steps behind, began to study cannabis in earnest. French psychiatrist Jacques-Joseph Moreau observed its effects with clinical interest. He believed hashish could help unlock the secrets of mental illness. Not cure it exactly, just light it up. He experimented on himself, on his students, probably on anyone who wasn't fast enough to leave the room. He wrote that hashish adds something of the marvelous to every impression, which sounds poetic, and also a little like the last thing you'd want your therapist to say before handing you a spoonful of glowing jam. And here's the debate that still remains. Were these artists and doctors actually advancing knowledge, or were they just getting really poetic while very high? Some historians argue that this was the beginning of cannabis being framed as a mind-expanding substance in Western culture. Others say it was just the recreational tourism of privileged men dabbling in something they didn't fully understand, making it exotic for fun. The truth probably lives somewhere between the jam jar and the velvet curtains. But back to Egypt for a moment. Because while the French left, hashish never did. In fact, cannabis use in Egypt expanded after Napoleon's retreat. It became a central part of daily life for many, especially in rural and working-class communities. In Cairo, you could find hashish dens, street sellers offering pre-rolled joints, and doctors quietly recommending it for everything from headaches to heartbreaks. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't controversial. It just was. Until, of course, the British showed up. You feel it before you see it. Ning. The bureaucratic itch, the colonial fear of anything that made people too happy, too relaxed, too unbothered by empire. British authorities, following their tried-and-true policy of interfering in other people's peace, began cracking down on hashish across their colonies, India, Egypt, and beyond. They called it dangerous, immoral, a risk to work, which, if you read between the lines, basically means too many brown people are enjoying this without our permission. But for now, here in this narrow alley in Cairo, a man leans back on a woven mat, breathes out a ribbon of smoke, and closes his eyes. You sit beside him, the pipe warm in your hand. Outside, the sun sinks below the buildings, and the city hums. There's no rebellion, no war, just a long inhale and a pause that feels like the whole world letting out a sigh. The sigh fades, and with it the alleys of Cairo blur into foggy streets and horse-drawn carriages. You're in London now, and everything smells like coal smoke, wet wool, and ambition. The year is somewhere in the 1840s, and the Industrial Revolution is chugging along like a soot-covered train no one can stop. Chimneys rise like fingers of warning. Ringing clocks sound across gaslit avenues, and if you listen closely, you can hear the sound of a nation proudly ignoring how tired it is. But tucked behind all this work, a quiet little cannabis tea party. Welcome to the Victorian era, the age of powdered wigs, social worry, and long-winded medical books. You walk past the stiff collars and tight corsets, right into the back room of a pharmacy where things are, well, looser. Here, cannabis isn't something to be smoked in alleys. It's packaged in fine glass bottles, prescribed by doctors, and sipped gently from china cups. If hashish in Cairo was about laughter and rebellion, cannabis in Victorian England is about relief, especially from being alive in the 19th century, which seems like a constant battle against drafts, wet shoes, and unexplained sadness. You look over the pharmacist's shoulder as he measures out a thick golden liquid. It's cannabis extract suspended in alcohol, branded with elegant lettering and impossible promises. Calms nervous disorders, relieves sadness, cures hysteria. If it sounds like fake medicine, that's because it basically is.
but with just enough science to keep everyone comfortable. Victorian medicine was obsessed with
Nicks, elixirs, and the fragile balance of body fluids. If you were anxious, sleepless, depressed, or just bored with your sewing, cannabis was quietly there for you. But you won't find anyone calling it weed. It's Indian hemp now, a name that adds a dash of colonial flavor and exotic distance. Doctors like William O'Shaughnessy, an Irish physician who studied in India, began introducing cannabis to British medicine with all the confidence of someone who just read a half-translated text and decided it was good enough for sharing. O'Shaughnessy tested cannabis on everything from epilepsy to tetanus and returned to England with glowing reports and a pocket full of samples. Boom! Victorian cannabis goes mainstream. And here's your interesting fact. Cannabis was not only used to calm nerves, but also given to children, teething powders, cough syrups. Yes, cannabis for kids in small amounts, of course. But still, imagine dosing your toddler with a liquid made from plants now banned in half the world. 19th century parenting, where every solution was equally frightening and soothing. Now, before you assume everyone was just gracefully floating around on cannabis clouds, it's worth noting how the drug's popularity was shaped by class. Middle and upper-class Victorians consumed cannabis in refined ways, drops in tea, candy lozenges, discreet powders. Meanwhile, working-class users were more likely to find it in fringe herbal markets, sometimes mixed with opium or alcohol. And as always, perception varied by who was using it and how loudly. That's where the debate starts crackling beneath your boots. Historians still argue over how widespread cannabis use really was in 19th century England. Some claim it was everywhere, tucked into medicine cabinets, pressed into common remedies, offered in every pharmacy worth its salt. Others say it was limited, restricted to a curious few and mostly forgotten once stronger. Faster-acting drugs like morphine and cocaine stole attention. Cannabis didn't knock you out. It just made the day feel a little softer around the edges, which wasn't quite on brand for the Victorian love of dramatic change. But there was something else happening under the surface. Stories. British writers and artists started flirting with the exotic images associated with cannabis and hashish. You drift into a smoky sitting room now, and a young woman is reading The Hashish Eater, a wildly dramatic memoir by American writer Fitzhugh Ludlow. He writes poetically about eating hashish, seeing astral projection, and touching the outer edges of human consciousness. Her eyes are wide. She folds the page. Maybe she'll write, or maybe she'll just keep imagining. It's a familiar cycle. Someone brings cannabis from somewhere else, wraps it in mystery, and sells it as a bridge to a more interesting life. Never mind that the people who originally used it didn't need a bridge. But the Victorians, bless them, loved a good mystic escape wrapped in polite words. Cannabis became a sort of living room dare. A curious little indulgence whispered about at parties and tried just once, maybe twice, under supervision, and then, as quickly as it bloomed, it began to fade. By the late 19th century, cannabis was already being pushed aside by newer, more exciting substances. The British drug industry began favoring morphine, codeine, and barbiturates, drugs that came with cleaner patents and stronger kicks. Plus, cannabis had a name problem. You couldn't quite predict it. Some people felt calm. Others got the giggles, and a few just passed out in their needlework. Not exactly textbook medicine. The stage is already being set for cannabis to fall out of favor. You see it in the medical journals, where once praised treatments become footnotes. You see it in laws starting to appear in colonial rule. Concern about Indian workers smoking too much ganja or Egyptian locals wasting their days in hashish cafes. In Britain itself, opinions are cooling, too unpredictable, too foreign, too hard to manage. You sit now in a small garden, fog thick around you, the teacup in your hand, still warm from the cannabis liquid someone swore would help with your constant nerves. It hasn't changed your life, but the tightness in your chest has eased. The world feels a little less sharp. You listen as church bells ring the hour, and a train whistles in the distance. Somewhere nearby, a mother gives her child a few drops of the same medicine. A writer paces her living room, thinking about India. A doctor marks a prescription with a quick flick of his pen. None of them know what's coming. The plant they're using quietly, legally, almost casually, is about to become one of the most debated substances in the modern world. But for now, it's just part of the background. To another remedy on the shelf, still wrapped in mystery, still balancing on the edge of magic and medicine, the teacup shakes slightly in your hand as the fog begins to thicken. And then it lifts quickly, sharply, like someone pulling open a curtain. You're hit with the sound of brass instruments, the slap of a snare drum, and a low, sensual trumpet moan that winds through the night like smoke through a keyhole. Welcome to the 1920s. The jazz is hot, the drinks are hidden, and the weed, it's finally here to celebrate.
You're standing under the flickering neon of a speakeasy sign in New Orleans. The street glistens from a recent rain, and people are crowding into a dimly lit club where the air is thick with sweat, perfume, cigarette smoke, and yes, cannabis, lots of it. It's not legal, of course, but neither is the gin being passed under tables and teacups. This is Prohibition-era America, where everything fun is technically forbidden and everyone's doing it anyway. You step inside and the sound hits you like a wave. Piano keys bounce off the walls. A stand-up bass thumps in the corner and the horn section blasts like it's trying to shake heaven awake. And there in the back corner, Bo. Both are the musicians bent over laughing, passing a joint from hand to hand like a cigarette rolled too thick and burning a little unevenly. They call it muggles, reefer, tea, grass, gauge, Mary Jane. The slang is endless and every city's got its own language, but the meaning is always the same. Jazz and cannabis go together like melody and rhythm. You slide into the booth. Someone nods at you, passes the joint. It smells sharp, peppery, alive. You take a puff, cough, of course, and settle into the beat. Everything's steady. The music hits deeper. Notes that were just noise a moment ago now feel like secrets being whispered into your blood. This is where the cannabis story takes a turn. No longer hidden in pharmacies or folk remedies, it's part of a living, pulsing culture. Jazz musicians across New Orleans, Chicago, Kansas City, and Harlem are lighting up before, during, and after shows. It's not just about being high. It's about breaking patterns, about seeing music from a new angle, feeling rhythm without rules. Louis Armstrong, yes, that Louis Armstrong was a devoted cannabis user. He even called it the gauge, and credited it for smoothing out his playing and keeping him grounded.
And here's your interesting fact. Armstrong was once arrested for smoking weed outside a club in Los Angeles. The police didn't know who he was at the time. He served a short sentence and later joked that he and the arresting officer became friends. As far as stoner beginning stories go, Louis Armstrong getting caught lighting up between trumpet solos is hard to beat. But with the buzz came backlash. Cannabis was still associated with Mexican immigrants and black jazz musicians, two groups America wasn't exactly welcoming with open arms. As cannabis spread into cities alongside culture, it also stirred up the same old fears: moral panic, corruption, the idea that people were using it to escape or worse, influence others. This is where the scholarly debate simmers like a backroom argument. Did cannabis fuel creativity, or did it simply offer relief from constant racism and systemic pressure? Was it a musical inspiration or a way to cope? The answer, as always, is both. Artists smoked to feel freer, yes, but also to keep going. In a world that offered them few rights, cannabis offered a kind of safety, a brief, buzzing room in the mind where no one could push them out. You walk through G.H. Harlem now, past the Apollo Theater, and into a Harlem Renaissance parlor where writers are reading poetry laced with rhythm and anger. Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston. Some tried it, some didn't. But the scent of cannabis hangs in the background like a jazz note bending in midair. The air is alive with music, ideas, defiance, and cannabis is woven through it all. Not the focus, but always close by, like a silent partner in the change. Meanwhile, newspapers start sharpening their pens. Reefer madness isn't a joke yet. It's the mood. Sensational headlines warn of youth corrupted, women seduced, and marijuana turning mild-mannered men into murderous lunatics. Spoiler, it's all nonsense. A tangle of racism, moral panic, and anti-immigrant anger wrapped in bad science and worse reporting. But it's effective. Public opinion begins to turn. And where opinion goes, laws soon follow, but not yet. Here in the 1920s, cannabis still breathes easy in the undercurrent. It's not mainstream, but it's everywhere. In music, in dance halls, in the private jokes between musicians. You find yourself at a backyard gathering in Kansas City, a barbecue pit smoking beside a record player crackling Ute Benny Moten tune. Someone gives you a hand-rolled cigarette. You don't ask what's in it. You already know. And here's the quieter truth of this era. For many people, cannabis was not just a party item. It was a breath, a break, a way to take back a moment of joy in a world that offered very few. In neighborhoods weighed down by segregation and poverty, it offered laughter, lightness, even if just for an hour. You sit beneath a fire escape now, the city humming around you. Above, a man leans out his window, blowing slow smoke rings into the Harlem night. The reefer's almost gone, but the rhythm, it keeps going. The beat doesn't stop. You close your eyes and let it ride. Their devil's music, jazz and swing, result from marijuana use. This marijuana causes white women to seek sexual relationships with Negroes, performers, and any others. Yes, that's a real opinion lifted from the bureaucratic brain of a man with too much power and a personal dislike. It wasn't just about the plant, it was about the people.
Anslinger weaponized racism, classism, and fear, mixing them into a thick moral syrup he poured over the entire country. You walk through a theater where jazz once poured out
The windows and find it closed now. Its posters replaced with frightening public service announcements.
Marijuana, the devil's weed, weed with roots in hell. They've swapped the trumpet for shaking violins and women screaming into mirrors. In the 1936 cult classic film Reefer Madness, you watch a group of perfectly healthy teenagers puff a joint and within minutes fall into insanity, sexual deviancy, and murder. It's so over the top you almost laugh, until you realize people believed it. This wasn't harmless panic. These stories paved the way for the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, the first federal law to effectively make cannabis illegal in the United States. You're standing now in the courtroom as it's debated. There are only a handful of experts present. One of them, Dr. William Woodward of the American Medical Association, tries to explain that cannabis has legitimate medical uses, that the panic is exaggerated, that the law is unclear and harmful. He's ignored. The act passes. From that moment on, cannabis goes from quirky cultural side character to outlaw. Grow it, you're a criminal. Use it, same. It doesn't matter if you're a jazz trumpeter or a farmer growing hemp for rope. Sud. Enli the plant is poison, a problem to be removed. But not everyone's buying it. You find yourself walking into a smoky back room in New York where the jazz scene hasn't died. It's just gone underground. Musicians still light up before sets. Writers still scribble late-night thoughts with a joint smoldering nearby. Cannabis doesn't disappear. It just goes quiet, shadowed, criminalized. The laughter is still there, but softer now, colored with risk. This is where the scholarly debate gets sharp. Was the criminalization of cannabis really about public health? Or was it a way to control marginalized communities under the excuse of law and order? Most historians today point to the obvious, Anslinger's own words, the targeting of non-white groups, the complete lack of scientific basis. It wasn't about the substance, it was about the story. And the story had teeth. Meanwhile, in Mexico, the plant's other alleged source of moral decay, the crackdown is underway too. You travel across the border to see soldiers burning cannabis fields, arrests made for simple possession, and the same American propaganda echoing in Spanish language headlines. Cannabis, once used in Mexican folk medicine and rural fun, is now framed as the root of all city unrest, which is rich considering that tequila has never once been blamed for starting a revolution. You start to notice the pattern. The more cannabis becomes linked with poor people, with immigrants, with black culture, with dissent, the more risky it's made to look. The newspapers, the films, the speeches, all designed to make the public uneasy. And uneasy people are easy to control. But here's your interesting historical twist. Despite all the bans and propaganda, the US government actually still supported hemp production into the 1940s. In fact, they launched an entire campaign during World War II called Hemp for Victory, encouraging farmers to grow cannabis, just the non-fun kind, for rope and uniforms. There's actual footage of government-backed videos explaining how to cultivate it, which means they knew. They always knew the plant had value. They just couldn't separate the fiber from the fear. You watch a farmer stand in his field confused, planting the same crop he was told was evil just a few years earlier. No reefer madness, no gateway to crime, just rope, just clothes, just work. Back in the cities, the cannabis scene is ducking lower, moving into coded language, secret pockets, and jazz records with winks baked into the lyrics. You hear it in songs like Reefer Man and If You're a Viper. It's in the culture, no matter what the law says. Because laws don't remove rituals. They just make them more clever. Now you're in Harlem again, sitting in a room where young artists pass a joint and talk about poetry, politics, and the nonsense of it all. Someone says they fear what makes us feel free. No one argues. The smoke rises soft and steady. You look out the window and see the world changing. Faster cars, taller buildings, bigger governments. But down here in this room with this plant, time slows. Memory sharpens. The story continues, not in textbooks or headlines, but in laughter, music, quiet resistance. The joint goes around again. Someone sings. Someone dreams of a world that doesn't fear the way other people find peace. The smoke curls upward one last time, then fades, and with it the soft tap of jazz fades into the rumble of engines and the clanking of steel. It's the 1940s now, and America is at war again. The world is burning. Bombs are falling, and everything that isn't necessary. Why gets pushed aside, packed up, or painted in camouflage? And for a brief, strange moment, cannabis, of all things, gets called back into public service. You land in a field somewhere in the Midwest. It's bright, flat, and humming with the sound of tractors. Uniformed young men walk rows of plants, not for a search, not for an arrest, but to check the crops. Welcome to the Hemp for Victory campaign, the US government project so ironic it almost collapses on itself. Less than a decade after the Marijuana Tax Act made cannabis a bureaucratic monster, here it is being grown by the acre, sponsored by Uncle Sam. You stand at the field's edge squinting at the rows of cannabis sativa. But again, this is hemp, the fibrous low-THC version. There's no high here, just rope. The Navy needs it, the Army needs it. It's used for parachute straps, ship rigging, canvas, boots, and more. Imported jute and other fibers from Asia have been cut off by war. So suddenly, hemp is back in fashion. Temporarily, of course. The government even produces a short film titled Hemp for Victory, encouraging farmers to grow cannabis again. You find yourself in a cramped schoolhouse with creaky benches, watching the flickering black and white film with a room full of dusty overalls. The narrator calmly explains how to sow hemp seeds, how to gather and break down the stalks, and never once mentions the word marijuana. Because let's be clear, this isn't that kind of cannabis. This is the good, patriotic, non-giggly kind. And here's your interesting fact. For years after the war, the US government denied this film ever existed. It wasn't until the 1980s that a copy appeared in the Library of Congress and blew the doors off that little historical deception, which tells you something. Not just about cannabis, but about how easily the story around it gets cleaned, rewritten, removed. But the war ends, as wars tend to do, and with it, the hemp revival. Almost overnight, the same government that told you to grow it is telling you to stop again. The fields are left empty. The processing plants shut down. Farmers are confused. Some are angry, and others go back to pretending they never touched the stuff. Meanwhile, cannabis itself is still illegal, not just disliked, actively criminalized. You step back into the cities where jazz clubs have quieted, and the new sound is swing. The cannabis that once swirled. D with the saxophones has now been locked up in police reports and parole hearings. The fear is rising. So are the arrests. You're now in a courtroom in a small town watching a teenage boy stand trial for having a joint in his jacket. The prosecutor compares it to heroin. The judge frowns like he's trying to decide whether this kid is a criminal or a disease. And that's how the story gets fixed. Cannabis equals gateway. No middle ground, no detail, just a one-way street to ruin. But here's the twist. While the official story hardens, the underground grows quietly, steadily in working-class neighborhoods, on college campuses, among beat poets who smoke and scribble in cafes trying to find the words that still feel real. You drift into a smoky apartment in San Francisco where someone's passing a joint and reading Jack Kerouac aloud. It's not rebellion, not yet. It's just curiosity, connection, a refusal to accept that peace has to come prepackaged. There's a subtle change happening here, a shift in how people think about cannabis, not just as a substance but as a sign. For some, it's freedom. For others, it's danger. But nobody sees it as just a plant anymore. It's a placeholder for 100 other conversations about control, fitting in, and whose happiness is allowed. You follow the threads back to Mexico, where cannabis is still illegal, but used widely, especially among rural communities and musicians. The term marijuana, spelled with a J, has become part of the culture, even as it remains a scapegoat for government actions. You sit in on a corrido ballad, the singer strumming his guitar and laughing about the soldiers who show up just a little too late to find anything worth seizing. The song is playful, but there's something bitter underneath. In Jamaica, another thread is forming. Indian indentured workers brought cannabis ganja with them in the 19th century, but by the 1940s, it's becoming a part of a growing spiritual movement, Rastafari. You sit with a group of men under a breadfruit tree as they light up and begin reasoning, discussing scripture, history, unfairness. Ganja to them isn't just a plant. It's a holy item, a tool to open the mind and connect with Jah. You listen as the words float upward like smoke, and you realize that this plant has been 1,000 things in 1,000 places. A rope, a medicine, a vice, a weapon, a path to God. And H. Here comes the scholarly debate. Was the World War II hemp revival a true rediscovery of the plant's industrial value or just a temporary convenience? Was the crackdown afterward about health or about restoring moral order? And what would have happened if they kept growing hemp, kept studying cannabis instead of stuffing it back into the vault of forbidden plants? You walk alone now through an empty hemp processing plant. The machines are silent. Dust coats the ears. In the corner, a sign still hangs crookedly. Grow hemp for victory. It feels like a joke now, like a forgotten punchline to a war no one wanted to laugh about. But outside, something's still growing in gardens, in windowsills, in the cracks of the sidewalk. Cannabis doesn't care about your laws. It doesn't need your approval. It just keeps pushing upward. You step out of the dusty warehouse and into a new sound. quieter at first, then rising into strange rhythms and improvised verses. It's the 1950s now, and America is trying its hardest to look tidy. Everything is beige and buttoned up, suits are crisp, lawns are trimmed, fridges are futuristic, and yet under all that clean white paint, something's rattling. You can hear it in the alley behind a diner in Greenwich Village. It sounds like a typewriter clacking through midnight, like a bongo drum echoing off brick, like someone whispering, "Dig it." You're in the world of the Beat Generation, a pocket of restless, messy wanderers who don't buy into the post-war fantasy of cheerful sameness. These are poets, drifters, and writers who hitchhike across America, write verse in gas station notebooks, and yes, light up joints in messy apartments while arguing about truth and time. Cannabis isn't an accessory here. It's part of the ritual, the kindling for a mind trying to burn through the fog of a too-perfect society. You're in a smoky room with Allen Ginsberg and a few others, watching the weed get passed around with the same respect some people give to bread and wine. Ginsberg's fingers are ink-stained and twitching with ideas. Kerouac slumped in a corner, half asleep, half writing in his head. You take a drag and suddenly the ticking of a clock sounds like a Morse code message from God. Cannabis isn't new to these guys. What's new is how loudly they're willing to write about it. Not with fear, not with shame, but with honesty. In a time when saying me, marijuana allowed could get you fired, these beats are naming it, celebrating it, embedding it into literature like a challenge. They're not claiming to be experts or prophets, just guys trying to shake the dead weight off their souls. And here's your interesting fact. Allen Ginsberg once publicly spoke in defense of cannabis legalization in the 1960s, long before it was trendy or remotely safe to do so. He argued not as a doctor or politician, but as a poet. His position that cannabis improved creativity and spiritual connection, and making it illegal was just another way for the system to dull the human spirit. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, something quieter is happening. In London's bohemian pockets, cannabis is slowly making its way into artistic circles. Jazz musicians, writers, and future rock stars pass it around in basement clubs, using it to soften the city's grey edges. But just like in the US, it's criminal, stigmatized, linked with foreigners and poor people. The wealthy might indulge, but they do so in whispers. Back in America, the authorities are doubling down. You find yourself in a courtroom again, but this time the person on trial is a high school kid caught with a single joint in his locker. The judge is stern, mentioning the moral decay of youth and sentencing him not to rehab, but to hard time. One joint, one kid, one ruined record. The newspapers eat it up, but the beats aren't backing down. If anything, they're lighting up more. You follow them across the country on buses, into cafes, onto roofs in San Francisco. The air is always thick with pot smoke and restless ideas. They write about time as a loop, love as a political act, God as a joke that only makes sense when you're high. It's not about rebellion for them. It's about clarity, seeing the gears behind the illusion. And here's the scholarly argument that keeps coming back like a hangover. Did cannabis really fuel their creativity, or was it just a crutch dressed up in poetry? Critics argue that the beats were more interested in being seen as defiant than in actually saying anything new. Others believe cannabis was essential, a literal muse that softened the barriers between thought and page. Either way, it's in the work. You can smell it between the lines. You're sitting now in a coffee house with a cracked ceiling and a stage made from an old door. A woman reads a poem that sounds, "She like it's being carved from her bones." She lights a joint afterward, not for attention, but because it's just what you do. A man in the back claps once slowly and says, "Far out." The mood is somewhere between group therapy and seance, but the world outside doesn't understand. Parents are panicking, politicians are foaming at the mouth, and the media is having a field day. Beats on pot. Youth lost to drugs and poetry. The headlines turn cannabis into a cultural sickness infecting everything pure and decent. You can almost hear Harry Anslinger clapping from beyond the grave. Still, cannabis finds new homes. It spreads beyond the coasts, beyond the jazz clubs and poetry readings, into college campuses, blue-collar garages, and lonely bedrooms in Midwest towns where nothing ever changes unless you smoke something and pretend it has. You duck into one of those garages now. Two guys in rolled-up sleeves passing a joint between oil stains and broken radios. No philosophy, no politics, just escape. Something to make the clock go faster or maybe slower. Something to make the nothing feel like something. That's the strange thing about this era. Cannabis isn't just one thing anymore. Not just for the poets or the criminals. It's creeping into every crack of American life, weaving itself into everyday people's routines quietly, illegally, insistently. You step back into the street. Somewhere, a radio plays Sinatra. A kid flips a quarter on a payphone.
And in the alley behind a bookstore, two teenagers are trying weed for the first time, laughing into their hands, unsure if they're high or just nervous.
The country still thinks cannabis is a danger. But under the radar in garages, cafes, dorm rooms, and basements, something is building a slow wave,
Not loud yet, but steady. Like a joint passed hand to hand, the story moves forward.
By the time the 1960s hit, everything feels like it's vibrating. The country isn't just changing, it's shaking. The suburbs are still painting fences and waving flags, but underneath that shiny post-war smile, something's rumbling. You feel it before you see it, like a hum in the soles of your feet. And then boom, you land in San Francisco. It's 1967, the summer of love. And cannabis, it's no longer in the corner, no longer whispered about. It's front and center now, carried in backpacks, tucked behind ears, rolled into joints tea.
He sighs of carrots and lit like torches. You're on Haight Street, and it's chaos in the best possible way. Tie-dye, tambourines, barefoot prophets, girls in flower crowns, guys with beards like prophets who forgot the joke. The smell of patchouli mixes with grilled corn and weed so strong you could bottle it and call it Rebellion Number 5. This isn't jazz cool anymore. This is psychedelic loud, and cannabis has gone from accessory to anthem. You sit in Golden Gate Park surrounded by 100 people who look like they all just escaped from the same mystical garage sale. Someone hands you a joint, and the label doesn't say sativa or indica. There is no label, just a look, a nod, a puff, and suddenly the sky feels way too close. The guy beside you is playing a sitar with absolute confidence and zero skill. No one cares. Everything is open. This is where cannabis shifts again, not just a personal escape or artistic inspiration, but a group ritual. People are getting high together, not just to relax, but to imagine a different world. No war, no hierarchy, no plastic smiles, just freedom, music, and consciousness. The politics start folding into the smoke you sit through. HA teaching at Berkeley, where a student shouts, "Weed makes you question the system." Everyone nods like it's a religious truth. Civil rights, Vietnam, feminism, environmentalism, cannabis hitches a ride with all of them. Showing up at rallies, in protest songs, in leaflets printed on hemp paper passed out on street corners with half-melted crayons. Here's your interesting fact. Cannabis was so central to the counterculture that the US government launched Project Chinese Letter, a little-known surveillance effort aimed at tracking Native American religious practices, some of which included ceremonial cannabis use. It wasn't just the hippies getting watched. It was anyone whose use of cannabis crossed into political or spiritual territory. Meanwhile, the music world goes absolutely cosmic. You drop in on a Grateful Dead concert and can barely see the band through the haze. At Woodstock, clouds of cannabis roll over the crowd like spiritual fog. Dylan, Joplin, Hendrix, each with a different sound, but all drifting through the same green smoke. Lyrics get looser.
Guitar solos stretch for hours. Albums become journeys. You're not supposed to understand what you're supposed to feel.
Tea wasn't just the music. Cannabis was showing up at communes, co-ops, and crash pads. It was a way to bond, to process, to soften the edges of reality when the world felt like it was on fire. And sometimes it was on fire. You walk through the aftermath of the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago, where protesters and police clashed, and the scent of tear gas lingers in the air. Someone nearby is still holding a joint, lit despite the chaos, like a personal act of resistance. Here's where the scholarly debate gets louder than the guitars. Did cannabis cause the counterculture, or was it just along for the ride? Some researchers argue that weed helped people disconnect from the main story, gave them the mental space to imagine alternatives. Others claim it was more symbolic than catalytic, a shared badge of belonging rather than a true engine of change. Either way, you can't tell the story of the 60s without it. You visit communes in New Mexico and Oregon, where people are growing their own food and their own weed. No labels, no packaging, just sun, soil, and trial and error. You watch someone carefully roll a joint while talking about nonviolence and goat milking in the same breath. A kid runs past naked, giggling. A dog may or may not be stoned. You can't tell. No one minds. Of course, the backlash arrives right on time. You flip through newspapers with headlines like "Marijuana use exploding among youth and drug culture threatens traditional values." Politicians start campaigning against cannabis not because it's dangerous, but because it's disobedient. Weed isn't just a drug.
It's a flag, and the people waving it are showing loyalty. Your feet take you to Washington, D.C., where congressional hearings about drug use sound like sermons from another dimension.
One senator declares cannabis a first step on the staircase to hell. Another insists it's the reason young men won't fight in Vietnam. No one bothers to mention the science because the real threat isn't chemical. It's cultural. Back in California, the vibe is still holding strong, but the seams are showing.
The optimism of the early 60s starts curdling into something messier. Some people burn out, others drift away. The weed is still flowing, but the world is catching on and cracking down. Nixon's on the horizon with briefcases full of laws and a short list of enemies, and you already know what's coming next. But for now, you lie back in the grass at dusk, the scent of cannabis and eucalyptus in the air. Someone plays guitar nearby. Someone else reads Ginsberg aloud. You look around and realize that, for a moment, the dream is still alive, not perfect, not eternal, but real. Held together by music, belief, and the simple act of sharing a plant. You take another puff, the stars are just starting to come out, and for a little while, the world feels possible again.
You don't hear him before you see him.
Richard Nixon, looming like a storm cloud in a three-piece suit, jaw tense, voice dry as an old newspaper. It's 1969 now, and the incense-scented peace rallies are about to crash headfirst into the hard, scowling reality of law and order politics. The flowers in your hair are starting to wilt. The music's still playing, but the volume's being turned down slowly, deliberately. Nixon is in office in cannabis. It's just been promoted from cultural sign to government-declared threat. You're sitting in the back row of the Oval Office, not technically allowed, but you've slipped in under the cover of time travel curiosity. Nixon's pacing, ranting about drug fiends, long hair, and how Amari. CA needs to clean itself up before the rot spreads too far. And then he says it, marijuana is public enemy number one. That line echoes like a gong. A new war is being declared not on a country but on a plant, and by extension, on the people who happen to like it. And here's where it all kicks off. The Controlled Substances Act of 1970, Nixon's masterpiece of legal overreach. With a few strokes of a pen, cannabis is classified as a Schedule I drug, the same category as heroin. According to the government, that means it has a high potential for abuse, no accepted medical use, and no safety in any form. Doctors object. Scientists protest.
But it doesn't matter. The hammer has fallen. Hey, you walk out into the streets of America and feel the change immediately. Police budgets grow.
Arrests for possession skyrocket. SWAT teams get new gear. Prisons start filling with young people whose only crime was being caught with a baggie in the wrong pocket. And behind all this, a whisper campaign now shouted. Weed users are lazy, criminal, dangerous, not like us. But here's the thing. Nixon never counted on. Cannabis culture doesn't disappear.
It adapts.
It changes shape. You drift into a college dorm in 1972 where a group of students is listening to
Pink Floyd and passing a joint rolled with such precision it should be in a museum. They're talking politics, poetry, and what to do if someone knocks on the door. Weed hasn't vanished. It's gone underground again. Just like in the jazz clubs, just like in the beatnik cafes. But now it's angrier, sharper. It has something to say. Meanwhile, the hypocrisy grows legs. You flip through a government report from the National Commission on Marijuana and Drug Abuse, also known as the Schaefer Commission, which Nixon himself requested. And guess what?
The commission recommends decriminalization.
It says cannabis doesn't pose a major threat to society, that enforcement is too harsh, and that the criminal penalties do more harm than the drug itself. So, what does Nixon do? He ignores it, throws the report in a drawer. Because this war was never about science, it was about control. Cannabis wasn't just a drug.
It was a stand-in for dissent, and if you could demonize the drug, you could discredit the people who used it. Here's your interesting fact.
There are tapes, actual White House tapes, where Nixon is heard saying cannabis should be illegal because it fuels the left-wing youth, the anti-war, our protesters, and the black civil rights movement. He talks less about public health and more about how to criminalize his political enemies without saying it out loud. The drug war wasn't born in a lab or a hospital. It was born in a worried strategy meeting. But out on the street, people are still lighting up. You visit a music festival, not quite Woodstock, but still full of swaying bodies and secondhand smoke. The smell of cannabis wafts over the field like incense at a group baptism. Someone nearby is painting faces with glitter and saying things like, "The revolution will not be televised." You believe them a little. even if they're stoned out of their minds. By the mid-70s, a few states are pushing back. Oregon becomes the first to decriminalize small amounts of cannabis in 1973. Alaska follows.
Then Colorado, California, Maine. The tide is trying to turn just a little.
Lawyers are arguing. And all the while, teenagers are still sneaking joints behind 7-Elevens, convinced they're part of some grand conspiracy against boredom. This is also when NORML, the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, starts gaining traction. You sit in one of their early meetings where a group of lawyers, activists, and former hippies talk policy over sandwiches and ashtrays, overflowing with roaches. They're trying to shift the conversation, trying to remind people that this isn't about drugs. It's about people, about freedom, about fairness. But even as the reform movement stirs, the pushback sharpens. You walk into a courtroom in Mississippi where a black teenager has just been sentenced to 10 years for possession. 10 years for a joint. His mother weeps in the hallway while the judge goes to lunch. This isn't law.
This is theater. And here's the scholarly question still debated today. Did the drug war criminalize cannabis to protect public health, or to punish political dissent and communities of color? The statistics scream the answer, but the official story's still shifty, still dressed up in the language of safety, morality, and family values. Back on the West Coast, though, something's happening again. The spirit of resistance is back. You see graffiti that reads "Weed for Peace." You watch a group of Vietnam vets pass a pipe at a beach bonfire, laughing and crying at the same time.
You sit in a van parked outside a record store.
Where someone is recording a pirate radio segment on how to grow your own. Cannabis in the 1970s becomes a paradox. Illegal but everywhere, condemned but essential. People don't just smoke it, they organize around it. And it's no longer just about getting high. It's about not letting the system define you. The night settles in and you find yourself in a field outside a small town, lying on a blanket next to a transistor radio playing Neil Young. The stars are bright. Someone lights a joint. No one's trying to make a statement tonight. They're just trying to feel okay, to breathe, to forget for a moment the weight of the world. You take a puff.
The breeze is soft. And somewhere in the distance you hear the first cracks of the next battle forming. You exhale slowly, watching the smoke disappear into the early 1980s, a time that somehow manages to be both fake and severe. Everything is neon and hairspray on the surface, but underneath there's a pulse of panic. The disco ball's gone dim. The bell-bottoms have stiffened into pleated pants. And in the White House, Ronald Reagan has just announced that it's morning in America. But for cannabis, it's a bad dream dressed up in a cardigan.
You step into a suburban living room where the TV's glowing. A perfectly styled woman turns to the camera and delivers her famous line, "Just say no." It's Nancy Reagan giving the anti-drug movement a face, a slogan, and a tone so condescending it could make broccoli wilt. You glance around the room. A kid with a bowl haircut looks genuinely terrified. His mom nods approvingly. Somewhere off camera, a government budget triples. This is the beginning of a full-blown moral crusade, a brand makeover for the war on drugs. Cannabis isn't just illegal now. It's un-American, dangerous. The enemy of the nuclear family, the hard-working taxpayer, and the dream of Reaganomics. You watch as public service announcements pop up on every screen. A teenage girl holds up an egg. "This is your brain," she says. Then she cracks it into a frying pan.
This is your brain on drugs. You half expect the pan to burst into flames. The numbers of brutal arrests for possession spike again. SWAT raids hit houses over dime bags. Entire neighborhoods are targeted, especially Black and Latino communities where cannabis use is no higher than anywhere else. But enforcement is louder, harsher, faster. Zero tolerance
Becomes the buzzword of the decade, followed closely by mandatory minimums. No more second chances, no more room for detail.
Just handcuffs and sentencing guidelines printed in bold. And here's your interesting fact. In 1986, Congress passed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which created a sentencing difference between crack and powder cocaine, so massive it broke math.
While that wasn't about cannabis directly, it set the tone.
The war wasn't about substances. It was about symbols, who was using them, and how much power the government could get from saying no. You duck into a high school assembly where a man in a windbreaker is shouting about gateway drugs while waving a Ziploc bag of oregano for dramatic effect. The kids mostly roll their eyes, except the few who are now convinced one puff of weed will instantly turn them into an alley-dwelling zombie. The message is cartoonish, but the results are real. And yet, the undercurrent is still alive. You slip into a college dorm where Pink Floyd posters still hang on the wall. A group of students is watching Fast Times at Ridgemont High, quoting Spicoli between hits. The fear hasn't reached everyone. For some, weed remains a rite of passage, a soft rebellion against the polished plastic of the Reagan era. Cannabis humor starts seeping into pop culture, whether the government likes it or not. Cheech and Chong are still out there squinting and giggling their way through the hypocrisy. Saturday Night Live sketches poke fun at the overblown panic, and late-night TV keeps winking at the camera. You get the sense that the cultural split is widening between what the state insists cannabis is and what actual users know it to be. Still, the law doesn't laugh. You visit a courtroom in Texas, where a man is facing years behind bars for growing a few plants in his backyard. He's not a dealer. He's a vet with back pain. But the judge doesn't care. The sentence is harsh, and the courtroom applauds. Fear is effective, especially when it's neatly packaged in televised slogans and clean-cut politicians. But behind the scenes, another conversation is starting to take shape. In California, a handful of doctors and activists begin whispering about cannabis's medical potential, especially for patients with cancer and AIDS. The science is early, the politics are risky, but the stories are powerful. You find yourself in a cramped apartment in
San Francisco's Castro district.
A man with hollow cheeks is sitting by the window rolling a joint with shaking fingers. He hasn't eaten in days, not because there's no food, but because the chemo has destroyed his appetite. His friend lights the joint for him. 2 puffs in and the color returns to his face. He laughs. Not big, not loud, but enough cannabis didn't cure him what he gave him. It gave him sleep. It gave him a few hours where the pain faded like a tide. And for thousands of others living through the AIDS crisis, it does the same. Word spreads quietly from patient to patient, caregiver to caregiver. The government isn't listening, but the community is. Here's where the scholarly debate reignites like a pilot light. Did the war on drugs fail because it misunderstood cannabis, or because it deliberately ignored truth to maintain power? Was the damage done? Millions locked up, families separated, communities hollowed out, just collateral, or was it the point?
You sit now at a kitchen table littered with ashtrays, coffee cups, and copied flyers.
Someone's creating a petition. Someone else is calling City Hall.
They're planning to take it public medical marijuana. Gal, regulated, compassionate. The next battle is taking shape. Not just against the state, but against the decades of fear it left behind. Outside, the world is still unfriendly. You walk past a police cruiser rolling slow through a low-income neighborhood. A boy tucks something in his sock and stares straight ahead. 2 white kids across town just smoked in their dorm and laughed about it. Nothing happens to them. The double standard is obvious. The laws are still cruel, but the people are not giving up. Not this time. Cannabis, now in its most hated form, is also becoming its most strong. It survives Reagan. It survives Just Say No. It survives the frying pan.
Because the truth, once whispered in poetry and passed in rolled paper, is starting to sound more like a demand.
The air in the early 90s feels electric and exhausted, like a storm rolling in over a burned-out battlefield.
The drug war has carved deep scars. Whole neighborhoods gutted by overpolicing, prisons overflowing with people serving decades for ounces. But as the hangover of the Reagan-Bush era settles in, something unexpected starts rising from the ashes.
Hope not loud, not triumphant, but steady, it begins. With a whisper in hospital rooms and community centers, and it grows into a full-on movement. Medical marijuana. You land in San Francisco again, but it's different this time. Grimmer, quieter. AIDS has devastated the city. You walk through the Castro and see memorial posters stapled to light poles, quilts stitched with names and windows, with photos of people who aren't here anymore. But even in the middle of the grief, there's a kind of stubborn light.
A belief that suffering shouldn't be made worse by laws written in fear. You follow a man named Dennis Perron, a Vietnam vet and longtime activist who's quietly selling marijuana out of his home. Not to party kids, but to dying men, cancer patients, people with wasting syndrome. The government calls it dealing. He calls it compassion.
And eventually he pushes for something bigger. You sit in on meetings where activists gather around worn-out tables and brainstorm strategy.
They're tired, underfunded. Half of them are sick, but they believe in the power of this plant, not as a cure, but as relief, as dignity.
They write up a ballot measure. It's called Proposition 215, and it proposes something radical for the time, legalizing medical marijuana in California. And here's your interesting fact. When Proposition 215 hit the California ballot in 1996, it was the first time in U.S. history that voters, not lawmakers, would decide whether cannabis could be used legally and not just behind locked doors and whispered codes. It passed, barely, but it passed. 56% of voters said yes. The floodgates didn't open right away. It wasn't like one vote turned dispensaries into Starbucks. It was messy. Cities pushed back. The feds threatened raids. People still got arrested, even with doctors' notes. But something had shifted. Cannabis had stepped out of the shadows and into the conversation again. This time, it had patience on its side. You walk into one of the first legal cannabis dispensaries in San Francisco, a place called the San Francisco Cannabis Buyers Club. It looks like a cross between a church basement and a community clinic. There's no branding, no edibles shaped like gummy bears, just jars on shelves, soft music, and people quietly rolling joints in the back for folks too weak to do it themselves. And here's the interesting part. Many of the early patients aren't just here for the weed. They're here for the space, the sea.
An SE of safety.
For once, they can talk openly about something that helped them eat, sleep, or simply not hurt. For years, cannabis had to be hidden. Now, for a few hours at least, it can be passed in the open. But not everyone is celebrating. You step into a press conference where federal officials are condemning California's decision. The Drug Enforcement Administration starts raiding dispensaries.
Activists get arrested. In one strange moment, you see cancer patients in wheelchairs being handcuffed outside a clinic while a news crew captures the whole thing.
Public sympathy starts shifting, not because the laws changed, but because the images did.
And here's where the scholarly debate sharpens. Was the medical marijuana movement primarily about health? Or was it a strategic beachhead for broader legalization? Critics claim it was a trick meant to soften resistance and normalize cannabis use.
Supporters say it was the only way forward, fighting compassion fatigue with real human stories. Either way, it worked.
Soon, other states start to know. Oregon, Alaska, and Washington follow with their own medical marijuana laws. Then Hawaii, then Colorado.
By the early 2000s,
growing quietly, state by state, like vines creeping through the cracks of a concrete wall. And the cannabis itself, it's changing too. You step into a home-grow operation. Nothing fancy. Just a garage filled with low-humming fans and plants under soft purple lights. These aren't wild roadside weeds. They're cultivars now, grown with purpose.
Names like comic book characters, Northern Lights, White Widow, OG Kush. THC percentages climb, terpenes become a buzzword. The science is catching up to the culture. Back on Capitol Hill, the federal government still has its fingers in its ears.
Cannabis is still a Schedule I drug.
You sit in a congressional hearing where a doctor calmly presents evidence of cannabis helping with chronic pain, nausea, seizures. The committee nods politely, then shifts to asking about the children and gateway drugs. The policy doesn't move, but out on the ground, things are moving fast. Cannabis is no longer just a protest symbol or a burnout stereotype. It's medicine. It's an economic opportunity. It's a civil rights issue.
And behind closed doors, politicians are starting to admit, maybe not into a microphone, that the drug war didn't work. That the costs have been enormous. That it might be time to rethink the rules. You attend a candlelight vigil outside a courthouse in Los Angeles, where a crowd holds photos of friends and family lost to harsh drug laws. Someone reads aloud the names of those still locked up for nonviolent cannabis offenses. A few of them were arrested in the same city now, dotted with sleek new dispensaries. The unfairness is obvious. You feel it settle in your chest like a weight. But then a cheer erupts from the crowd.
News has come in. Another state has passed medical cannabis legislation.
A ripple of applause, laughter, tears. You realize you're watching a movement still fighting, still organizing, still growing. It's no longer just about getting high. It's about getting heard, about healing, about reckoning. And somewhere across town, under fluorescent lights and security cameras, a new dispensary opens its doors. A patient walks in, headscarf tight, hands shaking, and walks out with something that might help her eat dinner tonight, that might help her sleep, that might help her keep going. You step outside into the California night. The stars are out, the wind is gentle, and for the first time in a long time, tea. The future smells less like fear and more like flowering cannabis. By the time the calendar flips into the 2000s, the world is buzzing with pixels, paranoia, and dial-up tones that never seem to go away. Everything's getting faster, smaller, louder. The towers have fallen. The wars have spread. And the culture that once marched in sandals and rolled joints on album sleeves is now figuring out how to search online for how to make canna butter without getting flagged by the feds. You're in the digital age now, and cannabis is coming with you. You land in a dorm room that smells like ramen noodles and ambition. There's a lava lamp glowing in the corner, an iPod shuffle clipped to someone's hoodie, and 3 roommates sitting with legs crossed on a carpet that hasn't been vacuumed since Clinton left office. One of them is packing a bowl, another's scrolling through an early message board where people rate weed strains like fine wine. Suddenly, everyone knows what a sativa-dominant hybrid is. Cannabis culture, once passed by word of mouth in cafes and alleys, is now searchable, shareable, printable. The genie is fully out of the bong, but there's something else rising with it. Data, studies, scientific curiosity. You sit in a university lab where researchers in lab coats, not tie-dye, are analyzing cannabinoids under microscopes. THC is no longer just that thing that gets you high. It's a molecular puzzle piece. And CBD, that's the golden child now. Non-psychoactive, widely legal, and suddenly infused in everything from lotion to lattes. You blink, and now your grandma is texting you about full-spectrum gummies. At the same time, the medical marijuana movement is maturing. You visit a dispensary in Oakland, once underground, now licensed, regulated, and just a little bit corporate. The bud tenders wear lanyards, there's soft jazz playing. A guy in a polo shirt is explaining terpene profiles to a retiree buying cannabis for arthritis. This is a long way from Cheech and Chong. You half expect someone to offer you a membership rewards card. But it's not all smooth sailing. The federal government is still holding its line. Cannabis is still a Schedule I substance. Dispensaries get raided by DEA agents, even in states where they're legal. You sit in courtrooms where patients and business owners are being sentenced like drug lords. It feels like watching a play where half he cast thinks it's a comedy, and the other half still thinks it's a crime drama. Here's your interesting fact. In 2009, the Ogden Memo was issued. A little bureaucratic letter from the Department of Justice stating that federal resources shouldn't be used to target individuals complying with state medical cannabis laws. It wasn't a law. It wasn't even binding, but it was a signal. For the first time in decades, the feds were starting to blink. That same year, President Obama says offhandedly that he sees medical marijuana as an issue for the states to decide. It's not a declaration, but it's a shift. You can feel it ripple through the air.
Suddenly, people start talking openly. Legislators, celebrities, retirees, the story's changing. And cannabis isn't just surviving, it's rebranding. You walk into a conference center in Denver for the first ever Cannabis Business Summit, and it's like stepping into a parallel universe. Clean booths, branding teams, investors in impressed shirts asking about yield per square foot. The language has changed. It's no longer dealers and users. It's producers, patients, wellness professionals. Capitalism, ever the opportunist, has finally arrived at
The cannabis table, and it's hungry. And the laws, they're racing to catch up. In 2012, you're in Colorado when voters pass Amendment 64, legalizing recreational marijuana. Not medical recreational. You blink again, and Washington state follows. The crowd goes wild. The media goes crazy. The government mostly shrugs. What was once unthinkable has just become law.
Not by revolt, not by riots, but by voting.
The dispensaries in these states look like Apple stores now. Sleek counters, touchscreens, loyalty programs. You watch a tourist ask for something mellow but good for hiking. And the clerk responds like a sommelier. Strain guides, test results, QR codes. It's weed, but make it professional. And here's the debate sparking in the scholarly world now. Has legalization sanitized cannabis in its effort to go mainstream? Has it lost its cultural soul? Critics argue that the corporatization of weed has pushed out legacy growers, taken over the counterculture, and priced out the people who fought for it in the first place. Others say good about time. If legality comes with shiny packaging and tax money, so be it.
Meanwhile, people are still sitting in prison for the same plant now sold next. Tea to cold brew and bath bombs. You walk into a panel at a cannabis expo titled Justice and Expungement, where activists are reminding everyone that while weed is now a billion-dollar industry, thousands are still behind bars for it. It's not just a footnote, it's a split. Still, the momentum keeps building. More states pass medical marijuana laws, then recreational, then others start to decriminalize possession. Each year, the map of America gets greener, literally and politically. The polls show public support climbing like a vine, crossing party lines, generational lines, income brackets. Cannabis is no longer just a subculture. It's becoming a norm. You sit in a barber shop in Detroit where two guys are talking about starting a grow operation. You sit in a classroom in Oregon where a professor teaches a course on cannabis law and ethics. You scroll through Instagram and see brands pitching weed as well. Creativity, sleep support, intimacy enhancer. The plant is everywhere now in every tone and form. Medical, spiritual, entrepreneurial, social. But here's the thing that keeps pulsing underneath all of it. This didn't happen overnight. This wasn't inevitable. It was fought for by patients, activists, musicians, poets, people who got arrested, people who got sick, people who rolled joints and held signs and got laughed out of courtrooms for saying, maybe this plant isn't the villain. You end your day sitting on a back porch in Portland. The rain taps gently on the roof. Someone passes you a joint that smells like citrus and pine. It came from a dispensary. It's labeled, tested, legal. You light up, breathe in, and somewhere inside that smooth, familiar exhale. You feel all the decades behind you, tangled, strange, hard-won, and all the possibilities still ahead. The future is not here yet, but it's close. And for once, cannabis isn't hiding. The joint burns down to the filter as you cross the invisible line between the late 2000s to 10s and the shiny, chaotic now. You blink, and suddenly cannabis is normal. Not just tolerated, not even just legal, but practically expected in certain pockets of the country. The stuff of wellness blogs, real estate investments, chic dispensaries with subway tile and succulent walls. Weed has gone from beat poet's inspiration to soccer mom's sleep aid in what feels like a single exhale. You land in Los Angeles 2018, and the sun feels
extra smug today.
not because it's warm, but because this is the year California fully legalizes recreational cannabis, and you can feel the smug in the sidewalk. You pass billboards with clever puns.
Highly likely. Weed the people. Dispensaries open next to yoga studios and organic pet food stores.
You walk into one that looks like a gallery. White floors, minimalist displays, bud behind glass domes like sacred artifacts. A bud tender with a neck tattoo and an MFA in photography welcomes you like you're entering a spa. But behind the shiny counter and the $60 eighths is the truth. This is still unknown territory. You peek behind the curtain and see small growers trying to navigate zoning laws and fees so complex they could crush a spreadsheet. Legacy dealers who sold quietly for decades, now pushed out by big brands with deep pockets and compliance teams. Legalization brought honesty, yes, but it also brought capitalism's sharp elbows. Here's your interesting fact. In some newly legal states, there was such a rush to commercialize that dispensaries opened before systems were fully in place to track or tax the sales. In one instance, a cannabis shop legally opened its doors before. The state had figured out what the tax rate was. The line still wrapped around the block. People weren't waiting.
And the
for
federal
policy.
silence
They were
starts to
waiting
look
for a
more
new
like
reality.
denial and caution.
Meanwhile, the federal
you hop on a
government
plane
sits there,
legally
arms
carrying
crossed like a
cannabis
grumpy
between
uncle,
legal states,
refusing to acknowledge what's
Still a
happening
federal
at the dinner
crime,
table.
but you do it anyway.
Cannabis
because
remains
everyone else
illegal
does.
at the federal
You land
level.
in Denver.
Schedule
Step
1,
into a
same as
dispensary
ever.
where a
But states
barista-looking
keep
bud
shrugging.
tender gives you
By
a
the end
full
of the decade,
breakdown
more than half of the
cannabinoid
country has
ratios.
legalized
THC
medical
to
marijuana.
CBD,
Nearly a dozen
CBG,
states and
CBN,
Washington, D.C.
THCV.
have gone fully
It's no
recreational.
longer about getting high. It's about customizing the type of high. Functional, creative, sleepy, euphoric. You're basically doing pharmacology with a vape pen. And now cannabis has a cousin tagging along, CBD. The non-intoxicating cannabinoid bursts onto the scene like an influencer that doesn't want to party. Just stretch, hydrate, and journal about boundaries. You see it everywhere. On chalkboard menus at juice bars, in candles, bath bombs, pet treats, truck stop gummies. It's in your uncle's knee cream and your coworker's sparkling water. People who've never smoked a thing in their lives are now microdosing CBD to take the edge off. But here's the twist. A lot of it is unregulated. No one's testing the gas station tincture. Some bottles don't even contain what they claim. Yet, the demand keeps growing. The idea of cannabis as wellness becomes more powerful than the plant itself. You visit Las Vegas, where cannabis is legal and neon lit, and walk into what feels like an Apple store mated with a nightclub. Glass floors, club music, a giant touchscreen menu that lets you sort by mood, strain, terpene, or occasion. You're buying weed like you're choosing a wine pairing. I'm having a beach day, but also dealing with unresolved childhood issues. There's a strain for that. But then you drive an hour out of the city to a small town where a guy is still serving time for possession with intent. He was caught with a few ounces in 2004. Now he watches from prison as cannabis becomes a legal multi-billion-dollar industry he can't join. He applied for a license to enter the legal market after release. He was denied because of his conviction. And there it is again. The core contradiction that legalization hasn't yet fixed. The same plant that built fortunes is still haunting people who used it before it was profitable. Activists are shouting about expungement, equity, reparations, and some states are listening. You walk into a policy meeting in Illinois where lawmakers are writing provisions for EQ. IT applicants, licenses set aside for people from communities disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs. It's messy, imperfect, but it's a start.
And here's the scholarly tension.
Is the modern cannabis industry truly a freedom? Or just a rebranding of prohibition now, with better packaging and fewer arrests? Has the soul of the movement been watered down in the THC vape cartridge of capitalism? Or is this what victory looks like in the real world? Flawed, step by step, but still progress. You spend time with long-time growers in Northern California's Emerald Triangle, people who risked everything to grow in secret for decades. Now they're being boxed out by new regulations they can't afford to follow. You walk through their drying rooms, smell the same sharp, earthy terpene notes, and feel the weight of a bittersweet harvest. This is their life's work, and they're barely hanging on. But at the same time, new voices are rising. Black-owned dispensaries, women-led cannabis wellness brands, queer growers reclaiming space in an industry that's been historically male and bro-backed. Social media gives them a platform. They host pop-up education events, build communities, use cannabis
As a tool of healing and organizing. The grassroots spirit is still alive. It just wears better shoes now. You light up on a balcony overlooking a city that once banned weed with a vengeance.
Now the skyline glows with dispensary logos and billboards for infused seltzers.
You're older now, maybe just a little tired, but still amazed. You remember the fear, the hiding, the arrest records, and now here you are passing a legal pre-roll labeled with its THC percentage, batch number, and suggested music pairing. The air is thick with contradiction, with relief, with grief, with progress that still hasn't come fast enough. But you exhale, and for once, no one's kicking in the door. You wake up in the 2020s and everything smells like hand sanitizer and overripe bananas. The world is masked up, locked down, and doom-scrolling at 3 a.m. The pandemic has shrunk cities into living rooms and turned kitchens into classrooms. People are baking sourdough, cutting their own bangs, and trying not to scream. And in the middle of this anxious, blurry-eyed chaos, cannabis does something wild. It becomes essential. That's right, essential. You watch it happen in real time. In the early days, COVID, when cities are shutting bars, gyms, libraries, what stays open? Grocery stores, pharmacies, and in states where it's legal, dispensaries, cannabis stores. The same buildings that once got raided by the DEA are now being called critical infrastructure. Somewhere, a retired hippie is laughing into his sleeve while restocking a shelf of pre-rolls. You walk into a dispensary in Los Angeles, and the mood is calmer than the grocery store. Plexiglass dividers, masked bud tenders, hand sanitizer stations next to the indica edibles. A woman in yoga pants buys 3 tinctures and says, "This is the only thing keeping me from throttling my husband." The bud tender nods seriously like a pharmacist at war. Cannabis doesn't just survive the pandemic, it booms. Sales explode. First-time users show up in droves. Millennials turn to it for sleep, stress, and sour moods. Boomers come in for joint pain and immune system support. Gen Z, they're making weed TikToks and arguing about whether flower is vintage. Meanwhile, the numbers on the board keep climbing. Billions in legal sales, millions in tax revenue, and suddenly, politicians who once ran from cannabis like it was radioactive are now bragging about how much it's boosting state budgets. You get this strange moment where the same governors who once campaigned on tough issues now seem to be the ones who are in charge. On crime now smile into cameras while praising the economic miracles of legal weed. That's America for you, where principles are flexible if the profits are strong enough. But there's more going on underneath the sales figures. As the pandemic forces everyone inside, people start rethinking things, how they live, how they work, who the rules protect. And that conversation spills into cannabis too. You sit in on a virtual town hall where activists point out the massive racial differences that still exist in enforcement, even in legal states. In some places, Black Americans are still 4 times more likely to be arrested for cannabis possession despite nearly identical usage rates. It's a fact that's as old as the war on drugs. But now, more people are finally listening. You get another interesting stat. In 2020, while cannabis dispensaries were deemed essential businesses, nearly 40,000 people were still behind bars in the US for cannabis-related offenses. Let that sink in. Legal weed on one corner, prison time on another, all depending on where you are, what year you were caught, and what color your skin happens to be. That contradiction starts making headlines. Suddenly, expungement isn't just a nice idea, it's a demand. States like Illinois begin automatic record clearing for low-level offenses. New York writes social equity into its legalization framework. California retroactively reviews old sentences. And more people ask, if we can legalize the profits, why can't we decriminalize the people? The industry begins to mirror this pressure. You walk into a Zoom pitch meeting with a group of Black entrepreneurs seeking funding for a cannabis brand focused on mental health in underserved communities. They talk about stigma, access, equity. They talk about how cannabis has been used to punish people for decades and how it can now be used to heal. Investors listen. Some say yes, a few say no. But the pitch happened. That means something. And while the U.S. still struggles with its patchwork of state laws, the rest of the world starts moving too.
You jump to Canada, where recreational cannabis has been legal since 2018.
The shelves are stocked. The packaging is laying the taxes high. But the arrests almost not exist. Mixed reviews. Some say it's too corporate, too careful. Others say it works. People who know they can buy legally. They're not being locked up. In Europe, countries like Luxembourg and Germany begin flirting with legalization.
Mexico's Supreme Court rules that the prohibition of cannabis is unconstitutional. Thailand legalizes medical cannabis and even allows limited home growing, something no one saw coming a decade ago. The global tide is turning, not just in whispers, but in laws. Meanwhile, the plant itself is evolving again. You enter a high-tech growing facility where the humidity is perfectly controlled by computers. The lighting copies sunrise and sunset, and each strain is genetically mapped, like it's preparing for a space mission. They're not just growing weed anymore. They're engineering it. High THC, high CBD, low THC, THC-free, terpene-rich, nano-emulsified, full-spectrum, fast-acting. It's not your uncle's stash anymore. It's plant technology, but there's still tension.
You visit a small grower who's been crushed by compliance costs and tax rates. He's been growing since the 90s, before there were barcodes and security cameras, before the forms and license.
Legislation, he says, doesn't mean fairness. He's not wrong. In some states, the very people who took the biggest risks to normalize cannabis are the ones being pushed out of the new economy. And here's the current scholarly debate. Is the future of cannabis heading toward justice or just convenience? Can a plant rooted in resistance truly thrive inside a capitalist system designed to reward the already powerful? Or is that just the cost of normalization, that the soul gets polished down until it fits inside a retail box? You sit on a park bench in a city where cannabis is legal, watching a couple of retirees giggle over a pack of infused gummies. Two teenagers nearby vape quietly while debating the ethics of microdosing in school. A jogger runs past in a shirt that says Plant Power. A food truck offers CBD tacos. None of this would have made sense 20 years ago, and yet, here you are. Cannabis has gone from counterculture to consumer product, from street arrests to Shopify, from jazz clubs to gummies shaped like sleepy bears.
The plant hasn't changed, but the world around it has, and so has the way people use it, sell it, talk about it, and control it.
You exhale. The wind shifts. TS. Somewhere in the distance you hear the crackle of another law being rewritten. You don't know if it's progress or just a new version of the same old song, but either way, it's playing and the plant's still growing. The future comes quietly, not with a bang, but with a soft ping from your phone reminding you that your cannabis delivery is 5 minutes away. You're sitting on your couch in a hoodie, watching a computer-recommended documentary about ancient rituals while your dispensary app asks if you'd like to reorder your favorite 5.1 CBD.THC mints. This isn't science fiction. This is Tuesday. It's the mid-2000s and cannabis has become so woven into the fabric of everyday life that you almost forget it was ever controversial. Almost. You still feel the ghosts in the background of every branded vape and Instagram influencer strain review. There's the quiet echo of handcuffs snapping shut. But here, in this moment, the plant feels more available than ever before. It's legal in over half the United States, medically available in most of the rest. And the few remaining holdout states look less like guardians of goodness and more like people who showed up late to the party and are pretend.
Ding, they meant to. You wander into a dispensary in New York City. It's all polished cement, reclaimed wood, and hanging plants. Some real, some fake. A playlist of ambient hip-hop rolls softly through the speakers while staff in matching aprons recommend products based on mood, intention, and food preferences. A retiree in a Mets cap asks for something for sleep. A grad student wants focus. A mom in athleisure whispers about low-dose edibles she can take without anyone noticing.
This is what cannabis looks like now. Not rebellion, not shame, just life.
And here's your interesting fact. By 2025, some cannabis companies have gone public on the stock market. Not in a back alley kind of way, but with suits and opening bells and analyst reports. There's a cannabis ETF. There are financial advisors who specialize in plant-based investments. Weed isn't just legal now, it's investment big, but that doesn't mean the past has disappeared. You attend a conference on cannabis equity, where speakers from around the country share stories that are hard to hear.
A man talks about being denied a license in his home state because of a 20-year-old conviction for a cannabis offense. A woman explained how her dispensary was approved in a social equity zone. But then a bigger company offered her a buyout she couldn't afford to turn down. One step forward, 2 buyouts back. Still, there are wins. States like New York and Massachusetts have started issuing licenses to formerly incarcerated individuals and prioritizing minority-owned businesses. Programs designed to repair the damage of the drug war are slowly, painfully taking shape. They're not perfect. Some are underfunded.
Others get tied up in bureaucracy, but the idea is there. Cannabis can't be truly legal until it's fair.
We take a drive through the Midwest where things are changing slower but changing nonetheless. In Illinois, dispensaries operate in small towns that once arrested people for a single joint. In Missouri, voters pass adult use legalization at the ballot box, carried by a surprising mix of conservatives and libertarians who are just plain tired of seeing prisons filled for petty weed offenses. Even places you'd never expect, deep red counties with more cows than people. Start talking about the tax income, the job creation, the quiet sense of why not. Here's the scholarly debate still causing heat in university.
Thai classrooms and city councils alike. What comes after legalization? Is the goal simply legal access, or is it reparation, restoration, and a rewriting of the story? Some scholars say cannabis is in danger of becoming just another product, another thing to package, profit from, and forget the messy history of. Others argue that full normalization is the victory, that making cannabis boring is the ultimate sign of progress. You walk into a suburban chain store that sells cannabis alongside essential oils and yoga mats. There's an entire aisle for mindful relaxation featuring hemp-derived Delta-8 CBD. Isolate and herbal blends that smell like someone went full moonchild with a label maker. It's charming. It's weird. It's a little sad, but it's real. Meanwhile, the federal government is finally starting to catch up. You sit in the gallery of the U.S. Capitol as lawmakers debate descheduling cannabis, removing it entirely from the Controlled Substances Act. Not just rescheduling it lower, but admitting that it never belonged there to begin with. The debate is careful, full of legal language and nervous laughter, but it's happening. You hear the phrases interstate commerce, tax parity regarding search access. For once, cannabis isn't being discussed as a threat, it's being discussed like corn. You visit a grow operation in Arizona that feels like a spaceship. Rows of plants under LED light bars, each watched by sensors tracking temperature, pH, and light exposure.
Drones fly through the aisles, spraying nutrients.
The growers wear clean suits. This is no longer a backyard hobby. It's agriculture tech. Cannabis has joined the ranks of soy, wheat, and almonds, only with better lighting and more security.
Yet, for all the technological progress, something old still lingers.
You visit a community garden in Oakland where neighbors grow their own cannabis, trade seeds, share advice.
It's not about profit, it's about connection. You sit on a folding chair next to an elder who remembers when having a plant in your yard could get you 10 years. She smiles as she cuts buds into a mason jar and says, "We're still here." And you believe her. And as the industry grows, so does the culture. Cannabis art festivals, infused dinners, sober curious events with cannabis cocktails, books, podcasts, documentaries, all digging into the tangled story of a plant that somehow became a scapegoat.
Sanctuary, a crime, a business, and a hope all at once. You end the day at a rooftop party in Chicago, where guests are offered joints on silver trays as a jazz trio plays. The sun dips low. You look out over the skyline and realize something strange. For the first time in generations, there's no need to hide. The plant is legal. The moment is quiet.
The air smells like possibility and a little like kush.
And while there's still work to do, people to free, records to clear, systems to fix, something undeniable has happened.
Cannabis made it, not just to the surface but into the light. The wind is gentle as you step into the near future where the line between past and present is blurry, and the air smells like lavender and citrus-forward hybrids. You're walking through a downtown farmer's market. Not some niche gathering of rebels, but a city event sponsored by the city council. There are booths selling sun-grown cannabis alongside heirloom tomatoes and handmade soaps. A woman in her 60s offers you a sample of her small-batch tincture designed for joint pain and emotional clarity. You nod, take a sip and realize, this is it. This is what normal looks like. It's 2030 or close N.
And the United States has finally done the thing.
Cannabis is legal at the federal level, fully, completely. Schedule 1 gone. DEA raids history. The final domino fell quietly with a vote that made headlines for a day before getting buried under something flashier. But the impact is huge.
It's not just that cannabis is legal now. It's free in a way it's never been before. Interstate commerce opened up. You can grow in California, process in Oregon, ship to New York, and sell in Florida. Suddenly, weed moves like wine or wheat. There are national brands, yes, but also regional favorites. A boutique grow in Vermont known for earthy sativas, a South Carolina lab making medical-grade THC patches, an Oklahoma edibles brand with a cult following, and a TikTok presence stronger than most pop stars.
But the industry hasn't swallowed everything whole. You step into a legacy shop in Northern California, wood-paneled, a little dusty, with jars behind the counter, and a cashier who's been rolling joints longer than most of her customers have been alive. The product is still good. The mood is unchanged. There's a loyalty here built not on branding but on trust, reputation, and the kind of community you can't buy with venture money. Still, money moves fast. You attend a global cannabis expo in Berlin, where attendees sip terpene-infused cocktails and tour vertical grow displays engineered for skyscrapers. The keynote speaker is an economist talking about global weed futures and sustainable hemp markets. Translation headsets buzz softly, while attendees from every continent nod and take notes. Cannabis is no longer a subculture. It's a world product and a cultural one.
Here's your interesting fact.
By this point, more people work in the cannabis industry than in coal mining and steel combined. Bud tenders, growers, extraction workers, compliance officers, marketing specialists, research chemists. It's a full economic system, and while the industry's growing pains haven't disappeared, the stigma has almost fully dissolved. You see former police officers now working in regulation, doctors consulting for dispensaries, grandparents comparing edibles like they once did vitamins. And yet the soul of the plant is still present. You attend a cannabis ceremony held by an indigenous healer in New Mexico. No phones, no branding, no sales, just ritual, smoke, silence, storytelling. Cannabis, like so many sacred plants, was never meant to be purely recreational or commercial. In this space, it's medicine, connector, reminder. You walk through a library in Detroit where a new exhibit titled Cannabis and the American Story fills the hall. Archival photos of jazz musicians, protesters, war veterans, dispensary founders. There are handwritten letters from prisoners, old normal flyers, and the original Just Say No scripts next to a panel on social equity legislation. You watch visitors take it in, some nodding, some stunned. A father explains to his daughter how his brother was arrested for weed in the 90s. They both stand there quiet in front of a photo of a dispensary now, operating in the same neighborhood where that arrest happened. The scholarly debates haven't ended. They've evolved. In lecture halls and think tanks, new questions are being asked. Has cannabis been overcorrected into capitalism? Are there risks in marketing a plant as a cure-all? How do we preserve its heritage as it becomes a global product? How do you balance access, regulation, and tradition? You sit in a grad seminar where students debate these issues passionately, not from theory, but
of lived experience. Some grew up with cannabis as a bit.
others only ever knew it as casual. You head to a rural town where cannabis saved the local economy. The factory closed years ago. The school almost shut down.
But then came a growing facility. Jobs, taxes, a reason for young people to stay. Not everyone loves it, sure, but the difference is real. The coffee shop reopened, the library people noticed, and now the final contradiction.
Justice. While many states have expunged records, many still haven't. You meet a man at a community legal clinic in Mississippi who's just had his 25-year-old conviction overturned. He gets emotional talking about missing his kids' graduations, job chances, whole chapters of life. And now he wants to open a dispensary, not out of spite, out of purpose, out of hope. And maybe that's where this story really ends. Not with the legal milestones or business empires, but with the slow, quiet rebuilding. The people who step out of prison and into possibility. The ones who fought for years to make the plant legal and now teach others to use it carefully. The communities that once carried the worst of prohibition now finding new identities. Thank you, new opportunity, new peace. You light up on a hilltop under stars that don't care about policy. A low, warm breeze moves through the trees. In your hand, the same plant that's traveled centuries, empires, and underground basements. It's not just a high. It's history, it's resistance, it's memory. It's memory, and now, finally, it's yours. Without fear, without hiding, just a little smoke curling up into the night. So now you're here, floating at the end of a long, slow exhale, watching the embers of this story glow dim against the backdrop of time. You've walked through deserts and dynasties, danced in jazz clubs, crouched in smoky basements, sat through government meetings, and nodded off under starry skies. All for a plant. One tiny leaf with 5 fingers and 1,000 stories. You've seen it worked, feared, burned, grown, banned, studied, smoked, and finally normalized. Not just a plant anymore, but a symbol, a question, a mirror. And what you realize as you settle deeper into your blanket is that cannabis never really changed. People did. Government shifted, cultures twisted.
But the plant, it kept growing quietly, patiently, pushing up through cracked sidewalks and high
Valleys, winding its way through centuries of contradiction. It offered peace when the world wanted war. It offered focus when thoughts raced, relief when bodies broke, laughter when nothing else worked. It didn't ask for fame or policy or billion-dollar mergers. It just kept blooming. You remember the early humans in the mountains of Central Asia, huddled around fires, maybe giggling, maybe praying. You remember ancient rituals with incense and hemp robes. You remember jazz musicians rolling up backstage, students lighting joints behind bookshelves, protesters sparking up on courthouse steps. You remember patients fighting for one more legal hit, growers tending plants like poetry, entrepreneurs trying to build something that wasn't just profitable, but fair. And now here you are lying back, maybe feeling that soft pull behind your eyes.
The fan humming, the lights are low. You made it through thousands of years in a single night, from Scythians to storefronts, from shadows to sunlight. And maybe you learned something.
Or maybe you just needed company while you drifted off. Either way, you're here, safe, soft around the edges, floating. And as your breath slows, just know the story's not over. The plant still grows.
The laws still change. The conversations still continue.
And you're part of it now, just by listening, just by being curious, just by staying a little longer.
Sleep well,